Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 363 of the Prancing Pony podcast, where sometimes things just work out a little too perfectly.
Which kind of seems to indicate that we had nothing to do with it.
Just about, yes.
Folks, pull up a bench in the common room and join us. I'm Matt, the Nerd of the Rings, and I'm here with the Man of the West, whose understanding of battlefield tactics is limited to the Total War video games, Alan Sisto.
That's about right, but don't forget Warhammer 40k, Matt. I didn't play Black Templars for a decade for
nothing.
Oh,
I would never.
I mean, come on. Folks, join us as we step away from Unfinished Tales tonight to bring back a friend of the podcast who's been our go-to expert for all the battlefield moves since Sean and I first discovered his blog shortly after we started the PPP.
I'm kind of a Space Wolves guy myself, for the record, but
Fenris. All right.
All right. Now, that blog that Alan mentioned is, of course, a collection of unmitigated pedantry, or if you like acronyms, a coup. A title which already told us he was our people. Now, that is, of course, the author, Bret Devereaux, and he is an ancient and military historian who is currently a teaching assistant professor at North Carolina State University. He holds a PhD in ancient history and an MA in classical civilizations.
Of course, really, he's more than a historian. He's a phenomenal fantasy nerd, sci-fi fan, and accomplished gamer. I believe he lists among his most important accomplishments beating Dark Souls. He's also appeared on 6 episodes back in season 7 of the PPP, 3 with you and I, Matt, when we covered the Siege of Gondor, and 3 more when Sean and I covered the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. So for those who want to listen to those, again, those are episodes 281 to 283, and then again 288 to 290. But since it's been nearly 2 years and we've been talking a lot of battles, we knew it was time to have him back.
And for a full episode at that, you guys are in for a treat today. So he's here to help us make sense of all the battlefield shenanigans that we've tried to understand over the last 11 episodes. So buckle up, folks, and enjoy a long episode of Unmitigated Pedantry. Welcome, Bret Devereaux.
Thanks. Wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be back.
We are going to have fun today. Well, folks, we started this whole Unfinished Tales run before we got into Unfinished Tales. We started with The Lord of the Rings in Appendix A3, 2 episodes on the House of Eorl, sort of straddling the holiday break. And I want to start with that story. It starts with an all too brief discussion of the Battle of the Field of Celebrant, but we're going to talk about that at length when we get to Cirion and Eorl later today. So keep your powder dry for that one. For now, I want to start with something that we read in the history of the Eotheod before they become the Rohirrim. Many lords and warriors and many fair and valiant women are named in the songs of Rohan that still remember the North. And then later, when speaking about Rohan to Frodo and Sam, Faramir spoke of how Gondor loves the Rohirrim, right? Tall men and fair women, valiant both alike. And then there's a draft in the chapter, The Passing of the Grey Company, where Tolkien's notes indicate that there was a time in the past where Rohirrim women rode to war. He wrote, as they did in a like evil time in the days of Brego, son of Eorl, when the wild men of the East came from the inland sea into the East Emnet. And then, of course, Eowyn herself claims to be a shield maiden and certainly fights as though trained for battle. Now, I know you've not yet seen The War of the Rohirrim, but I also assure you know that a woman features prominently and fights. I want you to tell us a little bit about the real-world parallels, women warriors in these sorts of cultures.
Yeah, so I think that the necessary background here is first understanding where Tolkien is coming from. Tolkien's cultural frame for the Rohirrim comes out of the sort of broad milieu of the North Sea in the early Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. Rohan's language, of course, quite famously is represented in the text as Old English, and this conceit is that it's being translated, but there it is. And the Rohirrim, while they're horsemen instead of seafarers, they borrow a lot from that milieu. Often this gets simplified to the idea that the Rohirrim are just like Anglo-Saxons on horses, but the thing to keep in mind is that the early English, Anglo-Saxons that Tolkien is working with are very much participants in a broader kind of North Sea Scandinavian inflected culture. Note, for instance, right, that Beowulf, the great Anglo-Saxon Old English epic, takes place in Scandinavia, and it's about Yeots and Danes. And so that sort of cultural space is fused. And here in Old Norse epic, we do see these figures later termed Skjaldmærs, shield maidens. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I'm sorry. I don't read Old Norse.
That's okay. Neither do we.
I've got two dead languages. That isn't one of them. And Tolkien uses that term in translation directly of Éowyn. So he's invoking that literary tradition. So female figures like this show up in the Norse sagas, perhaps world historically, most famously Brynhilda from the Volsung saga. Although today's listeners, the Skjaldmær they're probably most familiar with these days is from the Gesta Danorum is Lagertha.
Oh, yeah.
Because she was in Vikings. But these aren't the only figures. There are a number of others. It's not like every saga has one, but a lot of the sagas have one and some have a few. I should note the maiden part of Shield Maiden here is usually, but not always, operative. The sort of standard archetype here is that these are not yet married women. And one way that the Shield Maiden's tale often ends is after doing battle, she marries and settles down. The elder, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Hervor, for instance, is an example of this kind of archetype. And obviously, that is Éowyn's trajectory.
Yeah.
The other trajectory is glorious death in battle. There are no other options.
I'll take what's behind door number 2. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I suppose I say there are no other options. Lagertha herself is probably like the weird option 3 where you assassinate your husband and steal his kingdom. That's the last thing we hear about her in the Gesta Danorum is she marries Ragnar, is divorced by Ragnar, helps Ragnar in a battle anyway, and then after it's done, she is apparently remarried. She murders that guy and takes his kingdom, and that's it. And she's off into the sunset.
Enjoying her retirement in the new kingdom, yes.
Yeah, no, exactly. But so these figures are really common in the sagas, and they're in that space. Now, as you might imagine, that has sparked considerable debate for a long time among historians about the historicity of these figures, because the Skjaldmær, the Shield Maidens in the sagas are not historical figures, generally speaking. We can't really be sure that Lagertha existed. We can't be sure that she didn't, right? And so you want something a little firmer to say if this is a cultural tradition. And we do have a few indications that it actually might be. And I think the scholarly consensus at this point has moved to, yes, this was a thing that happened. Certainly not often. It wasn't a normal thing to do, but it was a thing that happened. We do have women warriors appear in some more clearly historical Norse texts, most famously here in the Greenland saga, where the tiny little Viking outpost in Vinland, which is to say North America, is getting overrun by the Skraelings, which is to say Native Americans. And we get Fredris Eriksdotter, who grabs a sword and goes to fight off while pregnant.
Wow.
And she charges forward while the men are retreating and shames them into giving battle.
Oh my.
We also have the occasional report from Byzantine sources that they are interacting with, Scandinavians, quote unquote Vikings. Mm-hmm. You're always going to hear me put quotes around Vikings. Viking is a job, not an ethnicity.
Exactly.
Now, those guys are coming down the Russian rivers into the Black Sea and then into the Byzantine sphere of influence from there. And Byzantine sources recounting battles with some of these groups do occasionally report, often with considerable surprise, like when the battle is over, they found that there were women among the slain as well as men. And they're like, to the Byzantines, they're like, what the hell?
Yeah.
They come from a cultural milieu where women definitely are not combatants on the battlefield. And, for a long time, that literary sources were what we had. And you do run into some trickiness because, Byzantine sources also love their Amazon analogies. And the Amazons don't appear to have been a thing, although sometimes your Amazon stories are connecting to female combatants among some nomadic steppe tribes, the Scythians, which does appear to have been a real thing. We have some burial evidence that was in fact a thing. More recently, what we've been looking at pretty closely are burials of what appear to be Norse women with weapons.
Okay.
And now I would note that burial evidence is also tricky because just because somebody is buried with something doesn't mean that they were using it. And in another cultural context, and we certainly do have female burials from contexts where we do not have a tradition of women fighting, where they might be buried with a sword, and often what's probably being indicated is something like lordship. This is a ruler, and the sword is an emblem of rulership. But we do now have a number of confirmed female burials. And if listeners are wondering why I'm making a point about confirmed, usually when archaeologists excavate a burial, you can determine the sex of an individual, usually from their bones, but that's not generally the process that you take when you've got a lot of these. You usually look at grave goods first. And so if you see, a distaff, a spindle, and some bracelets, female. If you see a bunch of swords and armor, male. But of course, this question, are there, right, which means, as an aside, you could have a situation where a female buried with arms could be classified as a male without anyone necessarily checking. So you're having a situation now where we're, with both new excavations of Viking burials and reviewing old finds, right? There's an increasing question of wait a minute, do we have any confirmed female burials with weapons? And the answer is yes. I mean, most famously, this 10th century burial in Birka, Sweden. And we've got a couple of others, or quite a few others actually now, from the British Isles. And so I think the scholarly consensus has now gone as okay, we have literary evidence, we have evidence from historical documents, we have evidence from Byzantine sources, and we have burials of women with weapons. The balance of the evidence is to suggest that this is a real thing that existed in this culture, that women, probably mostly pre-married women in a culture, I must stress, where the nuptiality rate is going to be close to 100%. So it's a question of when, not if, you get married, for both men and women, that they are going to war. It's not clear that they were called skaldmare, shield maidens at the time. That term, as far as I understand it, only begins cropping up in the 13th century. It doesn't show up in the sagas, to my knowledge. But again, I'm not an Old Norse expert. but I think on balance, I think we have to conclude that among some of these Scandinavian peoples, these are cultures where some women, the indication seems to be aristocratic women, do fight. At a certain sort of period of their life. One has to imagine by necessity at other times, and that, of course, implies that at least some women are being taught to fight.
Yeah.
And so the fact that, Eowyn knows her business is not necessarily shocking in his culture. She's the king's niece. She's grown up in his household, and there might be an understanding that she might have to defend herself under certain circumstances. And so, in this culture, and the idea that she would be prepared for that is not crazy. And Tolkien is drawing on this kind of rich literary tradition that has increasingly been backed up historically that we might assume to happen. Yeah. I mean, it's striking that there are cultures in which women fight in the sort of pre-gunpowder era. They tend to be few.
Yeah.
But Tolkien happens to be an expert in one of them. And so he's incorporated that. So yes, there is a historical basis for Eowyn kicking ass and taking names.
I like that. I like that a lot. All right, Matt, you got a question.
All right, so we've got another character that features in the War of the Rohirrim film, but we're going to stick to his book story for this question. That is Helm Hammerhand. Now, after Helm killed Freka with his famous single punch, he declared Wolf, that was Freka's son, who was rejected as a potential husband for Helm's daughter. He declares him the king's enemies, and then, of course, Wolf flees. But 4 years later, Wolf comes back at the head of an army of Dunlendings and nearly wipes out Rohan. Interestingly, the text says they were joined by enemies of Gondor that landed in the mouths of the Lefnui and Eisen, which I think strongly suggests that the Corsairs of Umbar joined in. Now, talk to us a bit here, Bret, about just how such an alliance could be arranged. I mean, it's not as though the Corsairs and Dunlendings are chatting on social media about how much they hate those Rohirrim.
But they would be if they could.
Yeah. And, Wolf was at least nominally a man of Rohan, after all.
Mm-hmm. So, obviously here, as always, when we're working with, appendices and unfinished tales and so on, we often get a text that is very thin.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so the historian brain in me is always casting as to what information do we not have that would flesh this text out? And I mean, if I got this in a historical text, there are a few things that I would be noting. I mean, first, Freka's effort to marry Wolf into the royal family, especially given his, shall we say, arrogant nature towards Helm.
Yeah.
I think we would read this as an effort to seize power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
he's got some military strength. He is trying to pressure Helm into a marriage that will give his son a claim on the throne as a rival to Helm's sons.
Yeah.
And that effort fails when Helm one shot knocks out Freka, right? Just straight one punch man's Freka.
KO.
Flawless victory. And then we're told that like Wolf is declared enemy. He has to flee.
Yeah.
So you've got this sort of princeling who has some support in the sort of borderlands of Rohan and among the Dunlendings who has to flee. And here I would note, right, 4 kingdoms with monarchies and succession. It's a good plan if you're an enemy of that kingdom, if you are Umbar. Just simply hanging on to like 1 or 2 dispossessed princes of your enemies is just a great diplomatic option. And of course, Wolf, as such a dispossessed prince, needs somewhere to go. If he just hangs out with the Dunlendings, there's a decent chance that Rohan will send an army to find him, right? Helm is going to come over with all of his cavalry and come looking. So he might flee to a foreign court.
Ah.
And if you're the Corsairs of Umbar, you're going to welcome him. Even if you don't have any immediate plans to do anything about it, he is good to just have in your pocket.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you can deploy him at the right time. And we're told that Gondor is also badly pressed in this moment.
Yeah.
And so it may have seemed like the perfect moment to expend this asset. And, from my own expertise, the Roman emperors loved keeping Parthian princes, like dispossessed Parthian princes in Rome. And like at points, it feels like they almost have like a warehouse. They always have 2 or 3 of these guys ready to go.
Oh, let me go check my Parthian collection.
Right, exactly. I'm just going to like flip open the book and like who lost the succession struggle last time. And in the meantime, if you're a Parthian prince and you're losing a succession struggle, if you stay, you die. The only guy who has the power to put you on the throne is the emperor in Rome. He's the obvious person to flee to, and he's happy to host you. And so I wonder if this is what's sort of going on in the background, is that if you are the Corsairs of Umbar, you host this guy, he could be useful. And then 4 years down the line, you sort of have your moment. So you give him some ships, some troops, some money, you drop him off, the Dunlendings join him. You've now neutralized Rohan as an ally of Gondor in a key moment you don't even really care, like, does Wolf win? You don't really care.
No.
You've just created chaos, which can be a workable strategy.
Yeah.
And certainly, once again, leaning on the Romans a bit, this is actually part of the Roman strategy in the long term for dealing with, this is somewhat earlier than my previous example, for dealing with the Seleucid kingdom.
Oh, okay.
What is today Syria and Iraq, particularly after the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Like the Romans are just perpetually meddling in Seleucid succession in ways that just maximize chaos. The Ptolemies are also meddling in ways that maximize chaos. And the result is the Seleucid kingdom just steadily begins to collapse because it can't get consolidated behind a single ruler.
Interesting.
And in the event, the Romans will end up abolishing what's left of the kingdom by decree in 63. They're just like, by the way, you're done. Because it's become so weak.
Time's up.
Yeah. But for this sort of prolonged period where the Romans are casually encouraging internal dissension. And so, this is a sort of play, and we might imagine the leadership in Umbar. And I don't know if we ever get a clear description of what the political situation in Umbar looks like, but, this is sort of a standard tool of strategy.
Yeah.
As you say, they're not on social media, so chances are this is happening because Wolf fled there.
Yeah. And that is an interesting addition that I don't think had crossed my mind, but it makes absolutely perfect sense. Like you said, historically, if he just hung out with the Dunlendings, he was going to get found. Mm-hmm. So you flee and you go to an enemy of your enemy. Exactly. An enemy of my enemy is my friend. And in this situation, I hadn't even considered looking at this from the bigger perspective of the Gondar-Umbar conflict. But absolutely, Umbar is going to put him to work to neutralize Rohan, so Rohan can't come to Gondor's aid when they are assailed on all their coasts, as I believe the text says. So, makes perfect sense. And at the same time, it prevents Gondor from coming to Rohan's assistance. Now, moving on real quick, still connected to Helm Hammerhand, and an interesting thing where I thought, well, wait a minute, what about this idea? We have talked on the show about this idea of weregild. Tolkien mentions it a number of times. We've tried to explain the concept as best we could. Now, Helm Hammerhand might not have intended to kill Freka. one punch. I'm not sure. Now I'm hearing Bullwinkle. You don't know his own strength. So this sort of negligent homicide is the kind of activity, the kind of thing that, if it weren't involving a king at the very least, would normally call for weregild. And the concept is not alien to the Rohirrim. Folks might remember that we talked about Gondor's steward, Turin II. He's said to have sent to Fulquina a rich weregild of gold when Fulquina's twin sons died in battle helping Gondor. So maybe tell us a little bit about weregild, maybe flesh that out a little bit more for us, and then whether a king could ever even owe weregild in the first place.
So weregild, the basic way to understand weregild is first and foremost politically, it is a system to avoid feuds.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is to avoid the blood feud where you answer somebody's crime, usually a violent one, with your own, and this escalates, forever. And the idea is a payment of usually money, precious metals, will end the question. And we have in all sorts of Germanic law codes, because this is generally speaking a Germanic institution, you will get big lists of here is the money value necessary to expiate a given crime, and you're essentially treating every possible sort of crime like a property tort, in that everything is answerable with a fine, up to and including murder. But that does also mean that there are weregild payments for negligent homicide, accidental death, if you build a house and it falls down on somebody, and that sort of thing. And of course, famously, one of the ways to read these codes is that the weregild payment often differs based on the status of both the person who did the crime and the person who the crime was done to. That said, the exchange of weregild also seems to pick up ritual significance, right? It expiates the stain of the crime, the moral and religious injury. And this is something we find in a lot of pre-modern legal systems, is the idea that the commission of a serious crime entails two kinds of harm, right? There is the harm to the victim, but then the individual who did the crime is also in some way ritually polluted or bad in some measure. This is, in ancient Greek law, the term for this ritual pollution is miasma. And that has to be, so even if you can get the victims to agree that everything's fine, for certain crimes, there needs to be a religious process to expiate the guilt. And for extreme crimes where that's not possible, they're kicking you out of the community regardless, because you'll attract the wrath of the gods. In this, you see a similar sort of bipartite notion of guilt in medieval Catholic practice, where there is both a kind of an earthly penalty to sin and a heavenly penalty to sin. You've got to sort of make good with the justice system, but you also need 53 Hail Marys, right? I'm being very flippant, and apologies to Catholics, right? But that's the sort of the same kind of there are two modes. Weregild notionally fixes both. At least that's my understanding of it. And you can sort of see this as a king. Helm has no one to pay weregild to. He is the authority from which these rules flow. And so he doesn't make amends with Freka's family. He kicks them out of the kingdom. He's the king. He is the source of these rules. And yet, nevertheless, I think almost you can sort of sense in the structure of the narrative, and Tolkien is imitating a way that we see these narrative structured historical documents, immediately following upon this crime is the downfall of Helm's house. And it's a downfall that is supernaturally inflected. Not only do enemies come at just the wrong time, but then the earth functionally dies under his feet, and the winter only breaks when Helm dies. For as long as he, with his indomitable spirit, refuses to give up the ghost, the winter will not relent. And the season of Rohan's misfortune will not relent, right? Because Helm is the problem, that he has breached the norms and he has to make amends. And the only way that he can manage to make amends for a man so inflexible and indomitable as Helm is to perish. And here I think the breach, as I would understand it, though the text doesn't say this, is probably twofold. There is the negligent homicide, but there is equally the problem that Freka is at Helm's council by invitation. He is a guest. And so the principles of guest friendship have been violated by both men. Freke by his arrogant and insolent talk, which of course produces the violent, the lethal response. And with the later death of Wolf, the destruction of his house. So Freke violates guest friendship, and he and his family line are destroyed for it. But Helm also violates guest friendship, and he and his line are destroyed for it. Right, and thus begins, right, because if
He's
I'm remembering correctly, the survivor is his nephew.
Yeah.
And so I think like this is sort of, again, in the skeletal structure, you don't get all of the theming built out. You don't have the Greek chorus coming on in the middle to be like, and this is why you don't do this nonsense.
We can use that Greek chorus every now and then. It's true.
I know. But the thematic structuring is so familiar to me that I'm like, I understand where this story was going. And if it had been fleshed out into a full narrative, right, we would have gotten a lot more motifs around this, because this is about twin violations of guest friendship, and Helm really can't just pay the gold to make the problem go away. And so the result is that there is both a temporal penalty to pay.
Right.
Wolf makes war on him, but also a spiritual penalty to pay, that like the very earth rebels against him because he has violated this norm. And and of course in ancient Greek or Roman, or for that matter Christian religion, there are ways to expiate that problem, to remove that pollution. In the Norse sagas, not so much. Right, they don't have as easy systems for the removal of that guilt, and so Helm has to expiate the guilt with a heroic death. It's the only way to do it. And so he essentially charges out, and they're like, okay, and he just doesn't come back. And then they come out later and they find him so inflexible that he is still standing, even though he is
which
dead.
Is at first glance heroic, but you're right, it is also an indication of his absolute inflexibility and his kind of incorrigible nature in that regard. Just completely, I mean, refusing to acknowledge anything that he might have done himself. That is a fascinating take on it. I don't think I'd considered
you could imagine like a fuller story that during the siege he would have advisors being like, you need to do something, and he says no, and then eventually he's like, oh shoot, this is actually all my fault, and so he rides out alone to resolve the spiritual problem, right? You could imagine that sort of story structure, which seems hinted at with like they stay and everybody's starving and Helm's starving and whatever, and then he's his sons go out to forage and are slain, they don't come back, and then he goes out, but he goes out alone, which is sort of you don't go out alone if you're planning on coming back.
Point. Yeah, even Helm Hammerhand, even with the myth of he bore no weapon so that no weapon could bite on him and that kind of thing. Fantastic stuff.
Right.
And I think, Matt, you and I have seen the War of the Rohirrim. I'm seeing a little bit of what he's talking about showing up in the film. Not a lot, but some.
Not a lot. That is one of my things that I wish we would have gotten more of is, Helm during the siege. But yeah, there's some interesting things that Bret has said today that I'm like,
I do too.
I like that this popped up in the film.
I know.
And I haven't seen it yet, so
yeah.
I'd say it did pretty good after all, even without seeing it. You've already definitely commented on it.
Yeah.
Great.
Right down the middle.
Yeah.
All right, Matt.
Now, sticking with Helm Hammerhand, and I love, you brought up the point that the winter won't break until Helm breaks, which is really cool that I've never thought about it in that sense. But speaking of the winter, talk to us about the effect of an unexpectedly cold and long winter for both the sieging force, which would be Wolf and his allies, and on the besieged. So in this case, Helm and what's left of the Rohirrim at Helm's Deep.
So there are a number of different impacts that an unseasonably cold and long winter are going to have for armies in the field. And the thing, of course, to understand, so armies in the pre-gunpowder, pre-modern past, I mean, they need three things to continue functioning, and that is water, which I hope is available locally because you're definitely not transporting it. It's heavy. Food, and then fodder for all their animals. Winter impacts both of those second things in exciting and difficult ways. As a result, it was standard even when you're having a mild winter. Armies don't usually operate in the winter. And you'll often see in reading historical sources, you'll see phrases like they wintered at such and such a place, or they went into winter quarters. And of course, a modern reader doesn't know what that means and often just sort of glides over that. What that's telling you is that that army has prepared a position with supplies to last through the winter. And the reason here is not just that it's cold. You go into winter quarters even in warm climates. Like the winters in Italy and Greece and Asia Minor are very mild, and armies still go into winter quarters. It has to do with the cyclical nature of the availability of food and fodder. So in most of these cultures in Europe, the primary crop is winter wheat. There are two varieties of wheat, spring wheat and winter wheat. They change in terms of when you plant them. Winter wheat is planted in October, November, and it is harvested in the summer. And so it grows over the course of the winter, thus winter wheat. Now, the problem is if you have a really harsh winter, that is going to delay the crop on the other end of it. It is also going to mean, right, your army as it moves is relying on its ability to pull food supply from the peasantry around you. They're watching their grain supplies and what they need to survive. With a harsh winter, their worry is that the main crop might fail. And so peasants are canny survivors. So you hide the grain. You do not let the army have it because you need it. And then, of course, the army is going to try and take it by force, but that's always an imperfect system. The other crop you might be really worried about in this context is winter barley planting. Winter barley comes in March or April, and a frost that lasts all the way into March could just kill it. And you're relying potentially on some of those early spring crops to bridge you over to the arrival of the wheat crop in summer. And so if it does not come, you are in trouble, so to speak. The other impact that we don't often think about, because people do think about food, but we don't often think about is fodder. And here the issue is green fodder. The campaigning season in the ancient and medieval world generally begins in March, in mid-March. And it is less predicated on the availability of grain for your soldiers, although it is certainly timed relative to that. But you can start when the grass is green and growing. And the reason is that you have all of these animals with your army. You have the horses your cavalry ride, but you also have pack animals moving your supplies and equipment. And you could feed all of those animals grain.
And that means you don't have a lot left for your people.
Correct. And so instead, you're almost always going to want to split your animals between dry fodder, which is hay, hard fodder, which are grain or oats, and green fodder, which is grass. And so the issue here is if you're in a climate where the expectation is that like the snows melt early and the grass is going to start growing in, February or April and be ready for your horses in March, and it's March and there's still snow on the ground, you have a problem, right? Either your horses are dying or you're burning out your people food to keep your horses from dying. And either option is bad. I should note here there are two key distinctions here between horses in the agrarian world and nomadic steppe ponies that are worth noting here. And I have certainly experienced lots of arguments as to if we should understand the Rohirrim as more like agrarian horsemen or more like steppe nomads. And the answer is they're more like agrarian horsemen. These guys are not Mongols. One, agrarian horses, in order to carry a heavily armored man into battle, generally speaking, are bred to be larger, feistier, and stronger. The issue is that very early, already by the early Iron Age, we're seeing cavalry horses that are sufficiently big enough that their nutritional demands are so high that they cannot subsist entirely off of grass. By contrast, the wee bitty steppe ponies that your steppe nomads are riding, your Mongols and your Huns, probably can't support a fully armored man, but they are small enough that they're basically wild horses, they can survive entirely off of grass. So some amount of dry or hard fodder is necessary even when the grass is in the field for an army like the one that Rohan has. The second problem is steppe ponies are extremely clever, and if you put them in a grass-covered field that is then also covered with snow, they will take their hooves and kick the snow out of the way and eat the grass. And for whatever reason, almost no agrarian horse breed knows how to do this. If you stick a big old Mustang or Charger in a field where the grass is covered with snow, it will starve to death.
Wow.
Because it will not be able to get at the grass. And so the snowfall is going to create serious problems here for both forces, because this certainly seems like a pretty loose siege of what has, in this moment become Helm's Deep.
Yeah.
Because we hear of parties going out and not being immediately opposed. So it's not like Wolf is camped outside of it. He has bases in the distance and they're contesting the space. You can do this. It prevents either side from foraging effectively.
Yeah.
But that's cavalry work. Both sides are going to have real trouble keeping their cavalry operational and their horses alive in a context where the green fodder isn't available. And then also, of course, finally, everybody's damn cold.
Well, yeah.
You're also dealing with, right? These are communities where their heating option is you cut down some trees and you light them on fire.
Yeah.
These are not, robust heating options. And the combination of extreme cold exposure with malnutrition is a recipe for fatal diseases.
Yeah, it is.
In both humans and animals. And so I think you can see kind of all of that rapidly grinding down the morale and cohesion and capabilities of these two groups. And it's striking that when the winter does finally break after Helm's death, Wolf, who is sort of holding court in Eteros, is overthrown almost instantly.
Yeah,
you can tell that he's every bit as worn down as Helm's forces were in the Hornburg, that he is like casually overthrown by
Freylof and 4 people.
Yeah, like Freylof and like 6 guys. Yeah. And so, I mean, absolutely, like this would be a terrible moment to have a really harsh winter. And it would also explain like the recovery from this moment might be slow.
Yeah, and the text tells us that as well, right? They did poorly in the dearth that followed. Yeah,
because you've potentially lost not only early harvest crops, right, but this could really damage the wheat crop, right, which isn't going to have grown properly. The frost will have killed it, and so you're going to have a bad harvest. This is going to impact your horse herds, which is Tolkien does, I think, elsewhere in Unfinished Tales. He shows an attention to the Rohan supply of horses.
Yeah.
Which is obviously a key military resource, but like an event like this, it's going to take time to rebuild those numbers.
Yeah, well.
And so, all of this is going to have lingering effects.
Well, that was a great set of discussions on the House of Eorl. We're going to take a quick break, folks, and when we come back, it's going to be time to get into Cirion and Eorl. All right, folks, important changes here. So if you usually skip this little bit, please hold off on that. We are going to get back to more Prancing Pony Podcast Pedantry, but before we do, we want to remind you there is a lot more talk going on at the Prancing Pony Podcast than just us.
That's right. The PPP has an amazing listener community. They're always coming up with great questions and discussions across all our social media spaces. Check out our common room on Facebook, our dedicated subreddit, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. Something new.
And something else new. Now on Facebook, just look for the Prancing Pony Podcast. Follow the page to get the news, but you're going to want to join the group for some great discussions.
Or if you prefer Reddit, find us there at r/PrancingPonyPod. On Twitter, Blue Sky, and Instagram, we're simply at Prancing Pony Pod.
And here's the new bit, folks. Please do not forget at Prancing Pony Pod on YouTube. So much there, folks. First, the brand new PPP Plays live streams, where twice a week I'll be streaming Lord of the Rings Online, playing Magic the Gathering Lord of the Rings, or Journeys in Middle-earth, or I'll be building Middle-earth in Legos, or Games Workshop's Battle for Edoras minis. Whatever it takes, we're just going to have Middle-earth fun twice a week.
YouTube.com/@PrancingPonyPod is also where you'll get Alan's daily Tolkien content from his short format show, Today's Tolkien Times. Now more than 400 episodes, most around 8 to 10 minutes, with everything from Mailbag Monday to Third Age Thursday to Silmarillion Saturday.
Now, you can also get the TTT in podcast form wherever you listen to this show, but be sure to check it out along with PPP Plays at youtube.com/@PrancingPonyPod.
Okay, with that out of the way, let's get to the meat of this conversation here with Bret. The battles that are mentioned or described in the story, Cirion and Eorl, and the friendship of Gondor and Rohan.
It's quite a mouthful, isn't it?
It is, yes. It's a very long title.
We'll just call it Kirion and Eorl.
Yeah, we'll go with that from now on. And even though Kirion and Eorl don't get together until 2510, the story we read began with the establishment of the Eotheod. We want to start there. Going back almost 900 years to 1635, the Northmen were hit hard by the Great Plague, and were still quite a bit weakened when the Wainriders began attacks 200 years later in 1851. Now, the first question from all of this, we spoke about how the Black Death killed anywhere between 30 to 60% of people living in Europe. How did that real-world plague impact wars over the next couple centuries? Were there smaller armies, peace through necessity, and unexpected death? What were we looking at there, Brett?
Forget about peace through strength. Peace through Black Death works.
Yeah.
I mean, so interestingly, we do see some ongoing conflicts that at points during this, particularly some of the wars between England and France, do kind of pause because nobody can put together an army that can engage in offensive operations. That said, warfare is based on surplus manpower, and one of the oddities for these sorts of population contractions and the way that populations react to them is that you end up with surplus manpower fairly quickly, right? Land falls out of cultivation as population contracts. And it should be noted in one of the oddities of the Black Death, of course, the land you drop out of cultivation is the marginal land. Mm-hmm. It's the land that's not very good. And so ironically, a catastrophic decline in population can mean an increase in production per capita. Like one of the real oddities of the Black Death is that it improved living standards for the survivors. Markedly so. We also see, like among other things, the Black Death, the value of labor goes up.
Oh, yeah.
If you're one of the surviving farmers, you can demand a much better deal from the big fancy lord who owns your land. But that could also leave land uncultivated in areas that will get described in our sources as deserted. I think it's striking, for instance, that this plague hits and we hear it described as impact on the north, but then like almost immediately the next thing we hear is that Gondor is beginning to contract its territory. And that put me in mind less of the Black Death and more actually of something like the Antonine Plague, which hits the Romans in the 180s and 190s.
Okay, yeah.
One of the things that in the aftermath of the Antonine Plague that we start to hear the sources complain about is that there are areas that used to be densely peopled in the Roman world that are not as densely populated anymore. And, eventually when we get much later on the other end of the 3rd century crisis, we're going to have the Romans essentially bussing in foreign peoples to fill up the spaces that are empty, which is, of course, exactly what Gondor is eventually going to do with the Erlingos, is indeed. Bust them in to fill their, there's nobody here in this spot, so it's all yours, buddy.
And now I want that to be the oath on the top of the Halathurian.
All yours, buddy.
It's all yours, buddy. In Quenya, no less.
Right. Gonna have to get somebody who's better at conlangs than me to figure out in Quenya what "it's all yours, buddy" is. That was something that kind of knowing how this is going to go over the next couple hundred years, that it put me in mind as here is the demographic crisis that is going to be followed by military crisis, that the large imperial state is going to respond by inviting in new sources of population in order to get a new supply of military manpower.
Yeah.
In the form of, obviously, Rohan's armies. And so, to me, I was like, it's fantasy Antonine Plague. I don't know that was what Tolkien was necessarily thinking, although there's no reason he couldn't have been. I mean, we talk a lot about Tolkien being, of course, deeply immersed in Old English and Norse literature, but he had the sort of classical education you would expect from someone who taught philology at Oxford. He was very conversant in Greek and Roman texts. He read Greek and Latin very well, and he knew them. And so I think that, there's no reason to suppose that these references are not also in his toolkit. And I think they do show up. And so, in particular, this repeated recourse to the idea that you can tell that the kingdom is failing because there are empty houses and empty fields is a repeated motif in later Roman literature. The agri deserti, the empty fields. And of course, Roman emperors are looking to fill up those empty fields, and they will bring in Germanic speakers to do so, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. And so this is kind of the context that I read it in, where I'm like, yes, okay, so this is an indicator of decline. Now, in this case, the bussing in of some barbarians is going to work great. And I do feel the need to notice, like, as a Roman historian, with the exception of the Vandals and the Huns, the quote unquote barbarians crossing the Roman frontier were almost always bussed in by the Romans.
Yeah.
They're being invited. And in a lot of cases in the near term, they are solving significant military problems. The Romans are going to successfully push the Huns back out of Roman territory with an army mostly made up of Germanic speakers. Right? Like, that was a successful effort. So I think there's a lot of complexity that gets subsumed into this barbarian invasions. It's not that simple.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Well, the next thing that happened, of course, was when the Wainwriters attacked. The Northmen, of course, bore the brunt. That's when King Narmakill II got his army together, pulled together a few Northmen, fight alongside him. He went to fight the Wainwriters. That would have been in 1856 in the Battle of the Plains. He got killed. His army was defeated. And like you mentioned in an earlier question, Gondor started to shrink. This is when they started pulling back their borders. But an interesting thing happened in the Battle of the Plains. We read that the escape of the army of Gondor from total destruction was in part due to the courage and loyalty of the horsemen of the Northmen under Mahari, a descendant of Vidugavia, king of Rovanion, who acted as rear guard. Now, we've kind of danced around this a lot, Matt and I, over the last several episodes, because we've noticed a lot of important rear guard actions in Tolkien. We see another one in the Battle of the Fords of Isen later on, and my mind always goes back to Hurin and Huor and the men of Dor-Lomin forming a rear guard, giving their lives to enable Turgon to escape to Gondolin after they're near Naiath. It's not something that we see in a lot of detail, but we see it mentioned a lot. So I would love for you to kind of get our listeners up to speed on what a rear guard action typically looks like. How do you measure the success of an action that's typically part of a retreat? I mean, you don't have a rear guard unless you've lost or are losing. And are they typically as important in primary world history as they seem to be in Tolkien? I mean, they're crucial in these battles that we see in Middle-earth.
I think I would start to say that when Tolkien crafts his battles, he is riffing off of, musing off of identifiable battle tropes and motifs from historical battles that we know. But you can sort of see that there are particular kind of heroic motifs that Tolkien likes a lot and he likes using. We get lots of sieges where a relief force arrives just in time.
Yes.
I think we'll come back to this in a second, but Tolkien likes also this kind of shove of push and pull. The side that is losing is being pushed back. Often, I think he has them pushed back further than I might normally expect, although not necessarily crazy far, but okay, that's a lot of push.
Yeah.
And so rearguard actions are also one of these things that Tolkien likes, because obviously the storytelling impact and the moral stakes of a force that is attacking to enable another force to flee, right, giving your life for another. It also has those good Christian thematic vibes, is all there. That said, I mean, this is something that some armies would do with varying degrees of success. So, for instance, the Roman army of the Middle Republic quite famously engages in 3 heavy infantry lines. The last heavy infantry line, the Triarii, only fights if things are going really, really bad, and sometimes their job is to essentially provide an opportunity for the rest of the army to get out of dodge and to make a kind of orderly retreat. That doesn't happen very often, but it does sometimes happen. Alternately, we'll often see troops posted at the camp for a pitched battle, and their goal is to kind of cushion a defeat. Though frequently you're defeated so badly that the enemy just then rolls over your rear guard and it doesn't much matter. But it certainly can be the case, and even in battles that are reported in our historical sources as truly crushing defeats, there is often a significant amount of the defeated army that makes it out. And there's a big difference between making it out, melting into the countryside, and making it out in one piece. So for instance, one of the greatest Roman defeats in 216 is the Battle of Cannae. This is Hannibal's great victory. But something like a quarter of the Roman army extricates itself from the battlefield, about 20,000 men, depending on the sources are different as to casualties and the size of the army. And there's a whole debate about whether there were twice as many legions. If the legions were double sized, and we don't need to get into that.
That would be pedantic, wouldn't it?
But it would be Polybius pedantry instead of Tolkien pedantry.
Wonderful.
And yeah, it'd be the wrong place for that.
Yeah.
But the result is a decent chunk of the army is actually able to flee, despite the fact that this is famously a double envelopment action. Hannibal has turned both flanks of the Roman army and sort of bear hugged them to death. But nevertheless, like a significant chunk of the Roman army is able to flee, reorganize, and regroup in a nearby fortified town where that component is eventually able to be rescued. And this being the Romans, those guys are shamed for having not died on the battlefield. They're organized into a pair of legions, the Legiones Cannensis, the legions of Cannae, and they're packed off to Sicily as a punishment post, because like you should have died when everybody else did. Though I will note that ends up being their escape ends up being quite valuable. Those two legions are, God help them, still in Sicily 14 years later, because this is a punishment position, so they're not coming home.
Nope.
When Publius Cornelius Scipio, soon to be Africanus, is putting together his invasion of North Africa. And these are part of the forces he pulls to be part of that invasion force, recognizing that these men who were disgraced will take any opportunity to get their honor back.
Yeah.
Now, most societies are not quite as hardcore as the Romans are about, like, you should be dead. What the hell are you doing here?
Right.
And some of that, I will note, the Romans are not always that hardcore about it. And some of this, I think, must be just the grieving process of the huge losses from Cannae and all the families that have lost their sons, and why is your son alive?
Yeah.
Kind of sort of a venomous, toxic kind of environment. Nevertheless, right, like those kinds of rearguard actions could matter, and extricating some part of your army as a viable fighting force restricts the options your opponent has. And this is, tactically speaking, what a rearguard action is doing. If you can keep part of your army as a viable, dangerous fighting force on the battlefield, which your opponent cannot do, is recklessly dispersed to pursue you.
Mm-hmm. They have to stay in order too, then. They have to remain in that formation, and
And that slows them down, right? Battle formations don't move fast. And if you're in all of your armor and kit, that slows you down further. And so that rearguard force can then enable the retreat of your force, which can then be potentially reconstituted, and you're not left in a position where you have sort of nothing to oppose the enemy's subsequent advance.
Right.
And this, goes to, right, like that the Wainwriters are pressing and they win, but then they don't overrun the kingdom.
Right.
Well, why? Because there's still an army. And if you advance deeper into their territory, into conditions that are maybe more favorable to them, you might find your victory reversed on you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the rearguard action can actually be pretty substantial. That said, Tolkien likes successful rearguard actions. I think we might come back to this at some point, the Fords of the Eyes. And
I think we might.
Yeah, Tolkien loves his successful rearguard actions, and there are maybe more of them in Tolkien than we would expect. Rearguard actions like this often fail. It is very hard to hold together a rearguard force like this. One, all the guys in the rearguard know that they're going to die.
Yeah.
And the army is collapsing around them. And so it's very hard to hold them together. This is something that is, to bounce over to the book, the Lord of the Rings books for a second, that comes out really clearly in the book version of Return of the King that is somewhat lost in its film translation. Faramir's rearguard effort, that truly a captain of men, to hold that together. He holds that together to within a couple hundred yards of the gates of Minas Tirith, this rear guard over, and of course his defense of the causeway forts has enabled the rest of the Osgiliath force to withdraw, which is, if you're the Witch King, this is a disaster because every guy that gets away is now going to be up on that damn wall.
Yep.
And Faramir is able to hold his rear guard together across the retreat. But this is, of course, because he's Faramir, captain of men. And, he's amazingly good at it. And he still has to be bailed out by a sortie at the end because this stuff is hard. And it's the moment that he, with his force of personality, goes down that the rear guard begins to come apart. Which is also, we see that a lot in our historical texts. And on the one hand, aristocrats be aristocrating, that the authors of our historical texts are aristocrats, and so they tend to see victory as the product of aristocratic virtue rather than, say, the results of like the regular soldier. On the other hand, the way that the tight social bonds in these societies work, it really may be the tight ties that these men have to Faramir himself personally, is what is holding them emotionally, psychologically in position. And when he falls, then like all is lost and things begin to fall apart very quickly. And you can see that sort of situation. And you can imagine that, right? Like the Marhari with his sacrificial rearguard action, he too must be a heck of a captain.
Yeah.
And, in the end, it's somewhat successful.
Yeah, indeed. Well, and of course, I'm thinking of all of those other ones where it is, aristocratic in that sense of Hurin and Huor. Yes, the men of Dorloman are there too, but it is those two and their loyalty to Hurin and Huor that enable them to provide that action protecting Turgon.
You even get this wonderful line when, and I love this bit, and I hate that I understand why it dropped out of the movies, but I hate that it dropped out of this movies. This wonderful moment of vulnerability when Gimli and Legolas are telling the story of traveling with Aragorn through the paths of the dead and then beyond. And I think it's Gimli who admits it was only Aragorn's will that held me there.
Yes.
That Aragorn had such force of personality. And like Gimli is a preposterously brave fellow. So what's being communicated here is the supernatural terror of the army of the dead. Mm-hmm. That it was only this sort of intense leadership that Aragorn shows that is able to hold anyone together in that context, even when the dead are on your side, because they're just supernaturally terrifying.
Yeah, that would be.
I guess the Lord of the Rings online joke, right? Gimli needs to get more, hope gear to hold up against
He needs a token. He needs a hope token. Yeah. +5 for 30 minutes.
I have not played Lotro in ages, but I remember that.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
All right, so let's turn to King Kalimekdar, that is Narmakil II's son. Now, he would eventually seek to avenge his father's defeat and death. Marhuini, the leader of the former Northmen, now the Eotheod, gave him news about the Wainriders' plans to attack Kalinarthon over the shallows of Anduin. In that same message, he told the king about a potential slave revolt. Captured Northmen who would revolt against the Wainriders were Gondor to attack. Now, this slave revolt didn't go quite all that well. Most of them perished in the attempt, for they were ill-armed and the enemy had not left their homes undefended. Their youths and old men were aided by the younger women, who in that people were also trained in arms, is what the text says.
Which, given that our Wainriders are our Scythian steppe nomads, here we have our Scythian warrior women.
There we go.
I love that because they are so clearly those steppe nomads, just as the Eotheod are essentially Goths before they become Anglo-Saxons. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So again, there we've got the warrior women, but in this particular instance, we want to focus in on the idea of the slave revolt or an uprising. Are they ever successful? Was this a doomed action in the first place, with the Northmen selling their lives simply to help ensure that the Wainriders are weakened somehow?
Okay, so the grim news here is that there is, in the whole of human history, there is one successful slave rebellion. It is the one that got us the country of Haiti, is the liberation of Haiti. That is it. Slave revolts almost always fail. What I actually find really interesting in this context is actually Gondor's willingness to encourage this kind of a revolt in order to gain a strategic advantage and to at least theoretically plan on supporting it, even though that doesn't work out in the end. One of the things that often surprises students looking at the ancient or medieval world is that you have these societies that all have varieties of non-free oppressed underclasses, whether these are slaves or serfs or what have you. And students are always expecting, clearly someone will exploit this obvious vulnerability in these societies, and then no one ever does. And the reason, of course, nobody ever does is that no one questions these social systems because they are ubiquitous. When you've got, 11 different slave societies clubbing each other over the head, nobody is interested in ending the institution of slavery in these societies. It usually doesn't occur to them. And if it did, there would be an understanding that it would be dangerous at home to do it abroad. And so like this in particular is striking. The one, of course, very famous exception is the Theban War against Sparta in the early 4th century. The Theban general Epaminondas defeats a Spartan army at the Battle of Leuctra in 371. And then rather than marching on Sparta itself, he marches straight past Sparta into Messenia, which is the other half of Spartan territory. The Spartans had captured this territory centuries earlier and had reduced its population to slavery, what the Spartans called helots. Sparta is actually kind of this is one of my hobby horses. Sparta's a horrific society, probably the least free society in the ancient Mediterranean. Some 65 to 85% of the population is enslaved in a status of slavery that our Greek sources openly admit was the worst in all of Greece, which is a really low bar. But what Epaminondas does, he recognizes that the weakness of Sparta is that so much of the economic underpinning of their social system, because the Spartans themselves are a wealthy, leisured elite, that they aren't allowed to work. They subsist off of all the slave labor. So he rolls into Messenia, declares the Messenian helots free, creates a new polis, a new political city-state for them, called Messenia, naturally, and that just cripples Spartan power forever. Now, what's striking is that like Epaminondas is not an abolitionist. He doesn't believe in like the theoretical end of slavery. He makes, for instance, no effort to free the helots that are in Laconia, the old Spartan territory. He leaves them there. What he's recognizing is that, well, yeah, but the Messenians are a distinct ethnic group. They're a distinct people.
Yeah.
That deserve to be independent. And so you can almost see the Gondorians being like, yeah, but these aren't enslaved Wainwriters. These are enslaved Northmen who deserve to be free of Wainwriter tyranny. And so we're not attacking the institution of slavery, which we don't hear that Gondor has. Presumably they don't.
But we don't.
But they could. Instead, we're attacking the idea that this people can exercise sovereignty over those people. Now, in the event it doesn't work, and that's not surprising. This is the perpetual problem that slave revolts face: is that while they are often, these societies have large numbers of enslaved workers who are prepared to revolt, they don't have weapons and they don't have organization and they aren't prepared, and it's very hard to get. So if you read, for instance, the narratives we have of the 2 Sicilian slave revolts in the late 2nd century in Roman-controlled Sicily, in both cases, the slave revolt's concern is like, how do we get weapons? We need large quantities of weapons to be able to fight the almost inevitable Roman army that's going to show up. And so you get things like, the revolting slaves will roll into a town and they will, pillage and murder everything except for the artisans, who are immediately put to work making weapons. And these sorts of negotiations. Now, in the end, it doesn't work. There are 2 slave revolts in Sicily. They both proceed along similar lines, that the initial small local Roman force is overwhelmed and defeated. The Romans proceed with a series of half measures that don't work, and then eventually send a major Roman field army, which wins easily. Because these guys, they just can't get enough weapons and armor and equipment to be able to go toe-to-toe with a major Roman field army. And I think we're going to get to, once again, when we get to the Fords of Isen here in a second, how rough it can be to be unarmored light infantry pitted against armored heavy infantry. But it's rough. So this is something that it's striking that the attempt here is made, and one wonders if Tolkien has Epaminondas in the back of his mind.
I like that possibility, because you're right. I think we do tend to forget that even though Tolkien's kind of favored area is Anglo-Saxon and Germanic, he definitely had that classical background, that classical education. He would have known a lot of that history, and I think it does us well as readers to remember that and keep that in mind, that it's not just, we don't need to look for parallels only in that part of history. So interesting stuff.
Yeah, and Epaminondas may not be a household name today, but if you read ancient Greek literature,
which of course Tolkien read a lot of ancient Greek literature. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of his time at one of his schools. I'm trying to remember which off the top of my head. He was involved in the apolostics, and they used to do these, recitations of plays. They would translate into Greek. They would take an English play and turn it into Greek and give it there, or they would do, of course, the original Greek, and he would have it all memorized. I mean, it's just fantastic stuff. All right, well, coming back to the Wainwriters, over the next 45 years, the text tells us that they licked their wounds and plotted their revenge before they came back in greater numbers and with allies in Third Age 1944. And it's that upcoming battle between the Wainwriters and Gondor that I really want to spend some time on in terms of just kind of digging into the tactics and things. First, I want to talk about Ondaher's actions. He's the king of Gondor at the time in the north as he approaches the Dagger Lad to fight against the approaching Wainwriters. We'll get to the southern army and Eärnil later. Now, for whatever reason, the text says that news of the northern assault did not reach Ondaher until the enemy was drawing near. The vanguard had not yet reached the gates of Mordor. The army was still apparently traveling in column through the narrow lands of Ithilien. You mentioned earlier formations and how they don't move very fast. Talk to us a little bit about army movements and formations. For those of us who don't play Total War or similar games, what is a column formation versus maybe more of a battle-ready formation? How do they differ? What are the strengths and weaknesses of those formations? And then, just with a little bit of hindsight, what should Ondaher have done to increase his likelihood of survival and success? Did he just not employ recon? I mean, how does the news not get to him? And what does that lead to in terms of the destruction?
Yeah, so here we're getting, I think, to a level of operational complexity that may even eclipse the Total War.
I think so.
Right. So Ondaher is clearly moving quite a large army given the way the subsequent battle plays out. And I think what we should understand is that he's probably moving an army sufficiently large that it's not moving in a single column, but that he's got several columns stacked down the road. This would be normal. If you put too many soldiers in a single column, the problem, right, at the end of the day, everybody has to make a camp and go to sleep. And then at the beginning of the day, you have to begin marching your army out of the camp. Now, an army of thousands of men may take up several miles of road space. But that means that whatever's behind them has to sit in the camp and wait for several miles of army to walk out the front door before they can.
Mm-hmm.
And so you reach a point, usually around 20 or 30,000 is the threshold here, where you start having to split your army up into multiple columns just in order to keep it moving. And so we might imagine there may be some separation between these columns. And so you would have, and here's where you will get the van or the vanguard, the main body, and then often a rear guard moving as three separate units, all moving down the same road in sequence. And so what's happening is Ondaher is reaching the southern end of where he wants to do his battle. He's not quite there yet with his vanguard. But the main body of his army is a few miles back down the road. And he thinks he has time to get his whole army up into the plain, encamped, and formed up. The Wainwriters have actually been pretty clever. What we're told here is that they've proceeded south from the Sea of Rhûn and then across the mountains, across the north of Mordor. Those mountains will have shielded their movements in the sense that Ondaher's scouts literally can't see them because they're on the other side of these big mountains. One also wonders, because the Wainwriters are a sort of pastiche of different periods of steppe nomads, if they're doing one of the crazy tricks that steppe nomads can do. Most armies, when they camp, have to light fires to cook their food, to bake bread and cook whatever rations they have. But nomadic logistics are different. A steppe nomad who's going to have anywhere from 5 to 9 horses connected in a string, it's literally called a horse string.
Wow.
So he's riding the front run and he's got the others trailing behind him. He can do a lot of interesting logistics. Steppe nomads, generally speaking, when they go to war with mares, not stallions.
Oh, okay.
And so with 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 horses, there's a good chance that at least one of them is lactating at any given time, because they're mares. And so he's bringing his logistic system with him. And so for a while, he has horse yogurt. The other thing he can do is, obviously they can hunt game as they move, and you can actually place the raw meat under the saddle that you are riding in. And the motion of riding in the saddle will press the liquid out. It will pull in the sweat of the horse. It will press that out. That leaves the salt of the salt water and the saline of the horse sweat, and it salts your beef.
The salted pork is no longer particularly good. Wow.
I know, right?
I think I'm a vegetarian for at least the rest of the day. Woo, man.
The term for this is saddle jerky.
Oh, man.
And it is edible, and the Mongols do this. We actually have some amusing Islamic and Christian sources who will see Mongols do this, and they're really confused because what they see is a Mongol reach under his saddle and just pull out some beef, and they're like, "Are you eating your horse?"
Oh, this is great. Oh my goodness.
Mongols could even, in order to retain hydration in small amounts, drink the blood of their horses.
Oh, wow.
Because horses can withstand periods of dehydration longer than humans can.
Wow.
Okay.
And again, you've got 5 to 8 of them, so you can spread out this burden across them. The result of all of this is like nomad logistics be different, but that Mongol armies can make unsupported logistics lunges across grasslands, lighting no fires.
Wow.
Which means they can just show up places. Where another army, you would see the campfires in the distance and then a little closer, and now they're here over the course of a few days. Whereas there's nothing. The Mongols are outside of your city and your host. The Mongols would even do things like they would move out a visual range of a city and encamp without campfires, like just over the hills, and the city would be like, hooray, the Mongols have retreated and opened the gates, and then boom, the Mongols are back. And so, I wonder if this isn't, we get the description of they're using the mountains to screen their advance, standard operations, even for agrarian armies. But I wonder if some of this, surprise Wainwriters isn't a bit of that steppe nomads moving without campfires and showing up ahead of time in places that they're not expected. Obviously, better scouting arrangements might have been wise. Ondaher might have been smart to send a flying column of cavalry to get to the battle space perhaps days ahead of him, and to confirm that it was clear. But encounter battles like this do happen. And they're sometimes unavoidable. I mean, these guys don't have aerial photography. They don't have satellites. They don't have GPS.
Yeah, they can't just task a bird to spot the...
It is possible for these armies to stumble into each other. And in this case, right, it seems like the Wainwriters have very intentionally aimed to produce that result. They want an encounter battle, and they get it.
They do indeed. Not only did they come along the mountain range, like you talked about, shielding their advance, that's also not the direction where they had previously come. Ondaher is said to have expected it to come from a different direction as it had come in the past. And, the Wainwriters, learning from that lesson, because they got beaten that time, decided to mix it up a little bit. And like you said, combine that with their ability to do these step-like logistics, and no wonder it was unprepared.
Yeah.
And just to say, you may well imagine the almost horror and shock that you get from settled agrarian sources watching Mongol armies that they're pretty sure are eating the flesh and drinking the blood of their horses as they rampage across the terrain, destroying everything before them.
That's a psychological weapon that you in a way were the Mongols aware that what they were doing was adding to the terror of their presence. In doing
Lord knows the Mongols efforted to add to the terror of their presence.
Yeah.
So yeah,
makes sense.
But it's striking. I mean, for both the Huns who show up in Europe in the late Roman period and the Mongols in the Middle Ages, the sources that we have for the period are like this is the wrath of God. The Roman writers encountering the Huns are like, by this point they're Christian, like, oh, this is the apocalypse.
Right. End times.
God is closing up shop on the Roman Empire and creation itself. And the Mongols are greeted sort of similarly. The arrival of a steppe host like this could be really terrifying. Now, the good news, if you live next to the steppe, is that these sorts of hosts don't emerge often. The nature of life on the steppe tends to create a lot of very small, very fragmented political communities that aren't huge threats to you. But every so often you get a charismatic leader like Attila or Genghis Khan who puts them all together and hits you with them, and there's not a lot you can do to stop it. And, it doesn't happen often. You basically just have to wait for that guy to die, and the fact that steppe nomads have partible inheritance to ruin everything for them, which is what always happens. When Attila dies, his 3 sons split his empire between them and are casually mopped up by the Romans. And Chinggis's heir, Ogadai, keeps it together for 1 generation, and then after him, fragmentation. Perpetual steppe problem.
Now, when the Wainwriters' vanguard reaches Ondaher in the story here, we read that the battle didn't last very long. Andoher had only time to turn and face the assault with his right flank close to the Morannon, and to send a message to another commander, by the way, when the chariots and horsemen crashed into his disordered line. And it says he was utterly unprepared to meet a charge of horsemen and chariots in great weight, and was himself killed along with his son. And much of that portion of the army is routed and ends up in the dead marshes, which is not where you want to end up. Spoiler alert.
No.
I'm curious, what would it have been like to face not just a charge of cavalry, but also of chariots? And how much more time would Andoher have needed to not be, as it says, utterly unprepared?
Yeah, what to expect when you're expecting cavalry. Yeah, this battle is probably unrecoverable by the time Andoher is aware that he is in a battle. The rule when it comes to cavalry, and this is also true for chariots, but I'll talk about chariots in a second. The rule for cavalry is this. Infantry in good order that is cohesive can resist cavalry. If you can keep your infantry together in a reasonably tight formation, cavalry cannot move you, no matter how hard they try. You cannot, no matter what Total War tells you, you cannot smash infantry out of position by hitting them on the front in that way. However, if you are scattered, if you are not in formation, you're host. Yeah. And the reason for this, you can understand this sort of the kinetics of this, that the horseman is coming in. It doesn't require, like, it can help, but it doesn't require like an overlapping shield wall or a hedge of spears. The Romans defeat cavalry charges with legions where the men are not overlapping shields. They've got decent space to use their weapons. There's actually decent lateral space. The Roman legions fighting formation is not widely spaced out, but decently spaced out. Each man occupies like 5-6 horizontal feet. So you're not like all bunched shoulder to shoulder. You can still stop a cavalry charge with that. And the why is psychological. If you're the horseman charging in, like, okay, if you roll in at full speed, you're going to slam into that first guy. You're maybe going to trample him or push him out of the way. But then your horse's momentum is basically spent. It's going to start coming to a stop. And you are now surrounded by infantrymen who in this context are more mobile than you on an unarmored horse. And many of them can attack you at once because your horse and you are very big. You're going to die. You're just going to get pulled off your horse and die. This happens, for instance, like famously at Agincourt, the French cavalry charge reaches the English line, and we're told some of the French knights end up in the English formation because they committed fully to the charge. Like they slammed in, and so they end up in the English formation, pulled off their horses, killed or captured almost immediately.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't disrupt the formation very much. Like they just hit it and vanish. However, if you can disorder that formation by catching it unprepared, by panicking some of the men, then what you can do as your horse comes in is you can weave through the open spaces, striking as you go, never slowing down enough for them to really get a hit back at you. And if you have a lot of horsemen doing this, you can sweep disordered infantry away. Very low casualties to you, ruinous casualties to them. And none of those individual infantrymen can do anything to resist you because your horse will just trample them.
Yeah.
And so I think this is clearly what happens to Andoher. Gondor's infantry is good enough that in good formation it can withstand a cavalry charge, but he doesn't have time to get them into that formation. He barely has time. He's got to deploy from column into line, which is a tricky task under the best of circumstances. And the best he can do is maybe turn some of his forces to face the incoming charge and hope for the best, and they don't hold together.
No.
It would be very hard to do. It would be surprising if they did. These sorts of encounter battles are catastrophic. I'm reminded actually of an engagement during the siege of Antioch in the First Crusade where a relief force, I want to say from Aleppo, but I think that's wrong. I think it's from Damascus. Anyway, the Crusaders are besieging the city of Antioch, and a Muslim relief force is coming up the road, and the Crusaders don't know that that's there. But they're running out of food, so they dispatch a large body of knights with their mounts to go foraging. And the mounted knights hit the front of this incoming relief force. It's an encounter battle. Neither side is expecting the other. and the relief force just crumples one unit after the other, all the way down, and is
Like
totally
dominoes.
destroyed.
Yeah.
Because it's just each unit gets overrun by this heavy cavalry hitting it one after the other, and it's never possible to put it into formation. And the Crusaders essentially destroy this relief army in just like a single catastrophic day, and then go back to besieging Antioch, where they're actually not having a lot of luck at this point. They'll get lucky eventually, but not right now. And so, like, I imagine something similar here, where Andahar's just his vanguard gets caved in, and he loses control of the battle instantly. There's not really anything he can do. Remember, this guy's command options. He can't like hit pause, flip to the aerial view, and order everyone to move. He has to yell orders and send messengers, and like all he has time to do is warn the other parts of the army, and then it's done.
Yeah.
The other thing is chariots, and here I'm going to somewhat unusually. I don't think Tolkien quite knows how chariots work.
Fair.
That's fair. Tolkien's sources don't know how chariots work either. So the great age of chariot warfare is the late Bronze Age. I'm talking about 1500 BC to around 1100 BC. By the time there's some excitement, our sources for the next several centuries are bad. By the time we can see clearly again around 900 BC, we're starting to see the emergence of true cavalry. If you have true cavalry, there is not a lot chariots are going to do for you. A man on a horse is a lot more useful than a man on a chariot. Chariots come first, and for folks wondering, wait a minute, why would you ever attach a cab to a horse before you had the idea of riding it? And the answer is that if you attempt to ride a wild horse, the first and 15th thing it's going to do is try to murder you. And it will probably succeed.
And the 2nd through 14th as well, yes.
Yes. Horse breaking is hard, so it takes a while to figure out how to ride horses as opposed to attach them to things that they pull. And the popular image of chariots is that they're like super battering rams. That's how they work in the Total War games.
That's true, they do. Yeah.
But actual war chariots are built for speed. They're light. I think the Egyptian desert is an amazing thing. Wild stuff survives in the extremely arid conditions of Egypt. And so like we have complete Egyptian Bronze Age chariots, like the cab that is just, it survives. It's made of wood. It survives whole. Yeah. And these things, like they weigh, I think it's like 55 kilograms.
Oh, wow. Not much at all.
110 pounds. Yeah. They're real light. It's a wood frame. And the thing you stand on is made of wicker.
Ooh.
It gives it a little bit of a bounciness, so you have kind of shocks as you're going across. Yeah, because you don't have any shocks on the wheels.
Well, no.
The other thing to note is that the wheelbase is wide, 7 to 8 feet for a two-man chariot.
That is wide, yeah.
Which in the Bronze Age, there is no weapon you can reach past that. You could push a spear forward, but your horses are in the way.
Right.
The weapon you're using from a chariot is a bow or a javelin.
Yeah.
It's a ranged weapon. You have a driver and you have a javelin man. In a larger chariot, you might have a third fellow with like a shield to protect the other two. Just as a sort of social class thing, the driver is a blue-collar professional. The archer is the aristocrat who owns the chariot. And if there's a shield man, he's another blue-collar professional. Artists in the Bronze Age will generally omit the shield bearer and the driver and just show the aristocrat in his chariot on his own. There's a wonderful, I think it's on the Kadesh inscription, where Pharaoh is in his chariot with his bow and he's just got the reins tied around his waist like he's going to hula hoop the chariot into battle. That is not how chariots are driven. But the artist has just omitted the driver because the driver is not an important person in the society.
And now it's just seeing the Pharaoh doing a little hula hoop. That's great imagery.
I mean, the funny thing is, in the text, the Pharaoh, this is the text of the battle, it's describing the Battle of Kadesh, although like the description is nonsense. It's all propaganda, but like the Pharaoh at points, he's like, my army is so cowardly, they've abandoned me. I'm out here fighting all alone. I'm so alone. There's nobody around me. So I turned to my chariot driver and said,
Sir not appearing in this film.
Yes. And it's like, wait, I thought you were alone, Chief.
Yeah, exactly. And the meaning of the word alone, let me just clarify.
Yeah. But the result is that it can be kind of tricky to figure out how these chariots function in battle because you don't want to charge them into the enemy.
No.
Unlike a cavalryman with a long spear, you can't really reach a weapon out in front of the horses. You have two horses and they are both in the front of the chariot. If something should disable either of them, the chariot is inoperable. And by inoperable, we mean it is probably turning over itself and throwing you on the ground fatally, like Chariot crashes are pretty hard to survive events. So this is a pretty fragile weapon system, that it's very fast. And so the usual assumption is that these are actually skirmishing weapons.
Yeah.
Now, certainly you could get a whole bunch of chariots charging at an enemy to inspire fear and panic, and that seems to have been done as well. But the only time you're actually going to commit that charge is if the enemy is already running away.
Yeah.
And then you're going to, again, weave through them, shooting your bow or throwing your javelin at enemies that can't really fight back.
Right.
Now, the thing is, Tolkien would not have had abundant access to Bronze Age literature. He'd have some, and he's clearly aware of some. Instead, though, because Tolkien doesn't, I don't believe Akkadian is one of his languages. He has a lot, so I don't know. I'd have to check. Instead, right, chariots are going to show up in Iron Age literature, where they are the vehicles of heroes and gods, and this is a very archaizing thing. You see this in Homer, in particular, in the Iliad. And Homer in the Iliad right now, Homer is a poet narrating an oral poem that is being written down probably around 750 BC about events that are supposed to have taken place in the 11 or 1000s BC, probably 1084.
Okay.
Or sorry, 1184. He knows that the heroes of his story ride in chariots. Nobody has fought in Greece with a chariot for a couple hundred years by the time Homer lives. Homer has probably, the only chariots he's seen are chariots used for processions, because it's also understood that gods ride in chariots. He's never seen a chariot used in battle. He doesn't know how they work. And so he imagines chariots as little more than battle taxis. The hero rides to the battle and gets out of his chariot to fight, which is about like saying that like a modern soldier rides to the battle in his M1 Abrams tank and then gets out to fight with his sidearm. Right. But like Homer doesn't know how these weapon systems work. Nobody uses them anymore.
Right.
The descriptions we have of them of the Bronze Age are very sparse. And so it's not surprising to me that Tolkien doesn't have a great sense of how these weapons work. And he's kind of merging Bronze Age chariot-based nomads, which were a thing, with Iron Age cavalry-based nomads. And the Wayne Riders are a sort of pastiche of these two things put together.
Yeah.
And I think if we want to get creative, we can imagine that maybe this is the transitional moment where true cavalry is emerging, but we still have some chariots on the battlefield. We do see that transitional moment in the early Iron Age, mostly in Assyrian military artwork. But mostly he's mashing together two quite different periods of sort of steppe nomad tropes to produce his Wayne Riders. To be fair, if they didn't have chariots, they couldn't have a cool name like Wayne Riders.
Yeah.
But they should probably either have just chariots or just cavalry. But so a chariot charge is also terrifying, but maybe less likely to sweep away an army the way that the onset of the Wayne Riders does.
Yeah.
And I will say, like, Tolkien doesn't seem to me to have a firm grasp on how chariots fight, but then like nobody does. Even modern scholars attempting to like, what are the mechanics of large scale chariot battles? I mean, the real answer is we can guess, but we don't know. Like I can tell you looking at these things, what they cannot do is that you can't hit anybody with them.
No.
And you're not going to be like riding around swinging your sword off the side because like the wheel is even further away from you. And the reason, if you're curious, the reason the wheelbase is that wide is so that these things can turn without flipping over.
Right. I was going to say the stability. I'm thinking, the little tiny narrow ones that, yeah.
You see in movies, they just
flip over.
Flip over, yeah. No, because the whole thing is these things are meant to go fast.
Yeah.
You're going 30, 35 miles an hour in this thing and you try to do a sharp turn. It's not all that heavy and it's kind of top heavy. You need a really wide wheelbase to keep it from flipping over. But the upshot here, I think, for the battle narrative is, infantry being engaged out of formation by cavalry is basically screwed.
Yeah.
There is not a lot you can do under those circumstances.
Okay. Well, interestingly, you mentioned the Crusaders' Night Force that just rolled up that entire relief army. I'm thinking a little bit about the Wayne Riders' initial success here being a little bit like that, just kind of rolling right on through, destroying, killing King Ondahere, his banner, and his son. But after the Wayne Riders' vanguard withdrew from battle to rejoin their main force in preparation for the primary assault, Tolkien throws us a little bit of a curveball. He says that initial victory was now the beginning of their undoing. Tolkien's fictional chronicler here says that they had actually launched that first attack too soon and, quote, they had met with a success far swifter and more overwhelming than they had expected. Now, that ended up resulting in a longer delay of their main attack, which kept them from using their primary tactical advantage, which Tolkien indicates was just numbers. When is victory a bad thing? And what would you have done as the commander of the OPFOR here to ensure victory after the defeat of the center and killing of the king? You'd think that's it.
Yeah. So, and of course, here's something somewhat annoyingly, right? Like the text breaks out before we get a really fulsome description of the battle. And the Wainwriters do end up winning the battle. So it's one of these, like, the beginning of their undoing, and like, in what sense? But certainly what's being described here is what in military study has come to go by the term of catastrophic success. Or a situation where things go right in unanticipated ways that you were not prepared for, often in negative ways. So here you have, right, presumably the expectation was that the front of Gondor's army would not collapse and would not be driven off. Possibly the hope is that Andahur would have been feeding forces in piecemeal to try and hold together as the strain built up on his front line. Instead, what seems to happen, right, is that the vanguard is basically destroyed. The back of the army gets the message that this has happened and deploys in Ithilien, in the relatively narrower and more hilly spaces, which is super bad news for an army based on chariots and cavalry.
Yeah.
And so, like, one wonders if the issue here is that having sort of punched in the nose of Andahur's army so quickly, they lose the opportunity to lure the rest of the force out into favorable terrain.
Yeah.
And are instead forced to engage on difficult terrain. And, obviously they succeed, but maybe this is a situation where they succeed, right, with too heavy casualties, because this campaign is eventually going to get out away from them.
Yes, it will.
And so, like, one wonders if this is a situation where they end up having to reduce this army that is maybe positioned on wooded hilltops, which is, I think, what we would expect in Ithilien. My impression is that Ithilien is both hilly and wooded, and that's not great terrain for cavalry. And so you're like, you're dismounting and fighting your way up the hills. You might win, but it's going to take a while.
It'll cost.
Take losses. Yeah.
Right.
One of these points where, like, the text just breaks off at, like, the worst possible moment. There's a couple of those today.
Yeah, there are. And that's actually why we brought you here. It's like, all right, fill in the blanks. What this might have looked like.
Let me tell you, though, as a historian, the text breaks off at the worst moment is a thing that happens.
Yeah, I got to figure that.
The example I can think of is we have two sources for the Battle of Pydna, 168. This is the battle that will lead to the destruction of the Kingdom of Macedon by the Romans.
Wow.
This is a very decisive battle. We have a complete narrative biographer, Plutarch, but one, you should never trust Plutarch on military matters. And two, it's a very short narrative.
Okay.
It doesn't seem to be, like, horrifically long, but it's often hard to figure out where he's going. And it's like, but we have Livy for 168. And Livy gives nice, fulsome narratives that he's usually quoting from Polybius, who we don't have. His book is lost for this period. But Livy's narrative has a frustrating lacuna in that he narrates the two armies coming near each other. They camp near each other. They offer battle. They don't take battle. And then the next day, there's, like, a skirmish around the water source, and that begins to blow up into a large battle, and everybody's coming out, and then ... And so the Romans are winning everywhere.
Oh, no.
That core narrative of the battle, of what happened, is
gone.
lost. And so all you have is Plutarch to try and make sense of it. And I think you can more or less reconstruct the Battle of Pydna. My colleague Michael Taylor has a good article doing so. But yes, situations where the sources just cut off at the worst possible moment, they do happen.
Yeah, well, Tolkien seems to do that a lot to us here in the appendices and in the Unfinished Tales.
The tales, they are so unfinished.
Exactly. That's
very apt name.
What it says on the tin, folks. Yeah.
Now, the law of Gondor around this time was that Andohair's sons, Artemir and Faramir, they're not allowed to go to war at the same time, and that's to ensure the survival of the royal line. But Faramir, we find, pulls an Éowyn, if Éowyn had been a colossal failure, that is. And he promptly gets himself killed in the battle after going in disguise. So speaking of this idea of, ensuring that an heir is left behind, is this something that, happens in the primary world? Do we have any examples of this working successfully, or do we have any examples of this Faramir-like behavior where a line is wiped out because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. Of course, there is a concern that if you've got your king and all of his heirs in one spot, you're in a great deal of trouble. Ironically, at some points in French history, we see instead the reverse. The king stays home and the Dauphin leads the army. You send the crown prince forward. But I mean, equally, you do get situations where armies will commit. The whole royal house is there, and it's just a disaster. But yeah, there is a tendency. I don't know of anywhere where it is a law.
Okay.
Tolkien here implies that it is the law that he cannot go. I can't think of, and maybe some medievalist has a better example. I can't think of a place where it is a law, but there is a sort of broad practice that you're leaving someone, and it isn't merely to make sure they don't die in the battle. But remember, these are societies without telephones and the internet. And so the administration of the kingdom is often physically located in the court. Sometimes that court can move. Sometimes it is fixed in a physical place. But you're not going to bring the court always with the army. And so you want to leave someone you can trust running the administration while you're leading the army, and your ability to advise and contact them is limited. And if you're the king, the crown prince if he's an adult, is a pretty trustworthy person to leave behind, or vice versa, to sort of split those, because you don't want to hand it to, your treacherous nobles. They will get up to all sorts of shenanigans. And so there's also a strong administrative reason to do this. But this was something I thought was interesting, because I read that and I'm like, I can't think of an instance where that was laid down in law. But it is customary. Roman emperors also aren't usually in the same army with their son. The exceptions that jump to mind are both from the year of the 6 emperors, which is Gordianus 1 and 2 in the same army, and Maximinus Thrax and his son both in the same army, and they come to grief for it both times.
There's a reason why they call it the year of the 6 emperors.
Yeah, the 6 emperors, and it's none of those guys who are alive at the end of the year.
It's not simultaneous.
That's a exciting and crazy year. And in the end, the winner of Emperor Roulette is actually Gordianus III.
Emperor Roulette.
While we're here, the other 2 guys are Maximus Balbus and the amazingly named Pupienus.
Oh my gosh.
All right, move on.
Look, if I have a chance to bring up Pupienus.
Yeah, how can you not?
I have to.
You have to.
That's his name.
Hilarious. And I think that's going to go in the blurb for the episode somehow. Speaking of royal lines with names that have nothing to do with that, once Andahare and his sons have died, there is, of course, no king in Gondor, and one eventually must be chosen. It ends up being the victorious Eärnil. He defeats the Wainriders in the Battle of the Camp. Like you said, the campaign does eventually get away from the Wainriders. He was chosen as the king of Gondor, but I want to give a couple of hypotheticals and get your take on what might have happened. The commander of the right wing was Minoktar. He was actually Andahare's nephew and a grandson of King Kalimektar. Eärnil actually had to go 2 more generations back. He was a great-great-grandson of Umbardakil. Now, unfortunately, Minoktar was killed. He was the commander of the right wing that they sent the messages back. He's the one who, as you said, deployed the army in Ithilien, a much more favorable terrain, but at the end of the day, it still wasn't enough to stop them. If he had survived, he would have had a better claim to the throne, right, than Eärnil. So that's question 1. And then following on from that, what do you think might have happened with Gondor had Minoktar become king instead of Eärnil? And then I'm going to throw one more at you, continue with this line of speculation. What if everybody died as they normally did, as everybody in the text did, but so did Eärnil in the Battle of the Camp? Would that finally have forced Gondor's hand to consider Arvedwi's claim from the north?
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of those exciting things. And one of the things that I've actually never done is sat down and looked at the sort of the whole of the House of Elendil to sort of suss out the inheritance rules.
Yeah.
Now, it's worth noting, like, we tend to think, like, oh, of course, there will be a solidly settled and clear, like, someone will have written down the rules of succession. But, like, the English don't get around to writing down the rules of succession until quite late. They are feverishly revising them after the death of Henry VIII in multiple directions. And so, in a lot of cases, rules of succession are customary. there's an understanding that like it's good if the new king is related to the old king, and the closer the better. But there are also other considerations that come into play as well. One thing I just straight up don't know, because I haven't checked, is if Gondorian inheritance is Salic. So one of the quirks in Western Europe is that some cultures allow inheritance through the female line and some don't. And most notably, cultures under Salic law do not. This is actually the cause of repeated friction between England and France, whose royal houses intermarried at various points. English succession could move through the female line, and indeed women could and did inherit the throne of England. By contrast, French royal succession was Salic in nature. It had to be male line.
Well, that actually is a very interesting point, because Gondor does seem to have followed that Salic law, in the sense that was the basis for the rejection of Arvedwi's claim. Because Arvedwi's claim, he was married to Firiel, the daughter of Andahare, and one of his claims was, hey, in Numenor, we had queens of Numenor. It was ruled that the eldest child, regardless of gender, would inherit the throne or the scepter. And Gondor's like, well, we reckon it this way. And it's only through the male line. So in this case, Gondor, whether they wrote it down or not, or whether they just made it up at the time, which is completely legit, they may very well have just been, let's find anything we can to turn down Arvedwi.
Right, let's find a reason.
Yeah. I mean, they clearly didn't want to give the line back to Isildur's line. But yeah, they appear to have been Salic.
Well, I mean, it's worth noting when the French finally run out of Capets, right? Because the Capetians get extremely lucky. And run quite a few straight generations with one viable male heir and no alternate claimants. It's really fantastic. We get the problem, and this comes in the context of the wars of religion, that they've got a Henry who's set to inherit Henry of Navarre, and the problem is that he's Protestant. And there is a sort of a question of like, well, could we change the succession law so that we can use the female line to dance around him? And it's like, so the problem is that the next closest is Check notes, Elizabeth I of England.
Oh my.
And they're like, can't do that.
Nope, that's not an option.
And then the problem is eventually resolved. Henry is famously, Paris is worth a mass. He converts to Catholicism, and then they call it a day.
Yeah.
So like this could be an issue. And it's worth noting that succession laws are often informal and sometimes somewhat chaotic. Macedonian succession for Alexander the Great's ancestors, the only rule seems to have been that the heir needs to come from the Argead dynasty, the Argead royal house.
Okay.
But beyond that, free for all. Just about any Argead seems to have been valid. Alexander's father, Philip, was not in line for the throne. He usurped his nephew to get it. And between Philip and Alexander, they murder most of their extended family for the purpose of resolving that issue, which is part of the problem, that when Alexander kicks it, the only two Argeads remaining are a not yet born son.
Oh my.
Who will soon be an infant son, who will be Alexander IV. And then Philip Aridaeus, a mentally disabled half-brother that everyone understands would need a regent to rule anyway.
Yeah.
And, the result is that Alexander's generals murder both of those people and seize power because, like, obviously that's what you do.
Well, right.
But, obviously, you just do some murder.
It's the obvious solution.
Right. But that gives you the sort of awkwardness of succession law. Meanwhile, jump over to the Romans, the Roman Empire. At no point between the foundation of the Roman imperial system in 31 BC and its final extinction in 1453, at no point do the Romans, 1453 AD, at no point do the Romans have a law of succession.
Interesting.
There ain't no rule.
For 1,500 years, there's no rule.
There's no rule.
There's just guidelines.
Yes. Now, the guidelines are like, if the emperor has a biological son, that's obviously the first choice. If the emperor adopts another person as his heir, you usually go that way, unless the emperor is wildly unpopular and currently the victim of a coup or an assassination, in which case maybe you also assassinate that guy. Near relatives are preferred over nobodies, but this is a problem that breaks out that, like, technically, anybody who can put together a big enough army is a viable claimant.
That's a good point. I guess the question about Minoktar and Earnil would come down to the relative size of their surviving armies.
Yes, it would. I mean, almost certainly, I think the difference in claim there might come down to, your bigger army diplomacy. And one assumes that, like, if Minoktar has just won the big battle, then his legitimacy is probably sufficient to carry him to the throne. If he has just lost the big battle but survived, and then Yarnil has won it, the nobility is not going to back him. He's a loser.
Right.
And the smart thing to do would probably be to both recognize Yarnil's claim and then find an excuse to be very far away.
Yeah.
And then, if all of them end up dead, then you immediately, you have this question, which is again going to be described to the nobility. If you have no options, you have this other line. Do you invite them in, or do you do what they eventually do? Do you go with the stewards?
Yeah.
Do you decide that
early on, maybe one generation earlier? Yeah.
Right. That line is so foreign and unacceptable that you have to instead elevate one of your own, one of your present nobility.
Yeah.
And this is a thing we see through the Middle Ages. The sort of question when there are such problems: do you invite in a foreign king? Especially in Central and Eastern Europe, we see these sorts of concerns. Or do you elevate a member of your nobility? And both of those choices have downsides, especially if the foreign king auditioning for the role is powerful, right? If he's like a Habsburg, then he may respond to being told no by invading to press his claim.
Yeah.
And so all of those choices are difficult. One has to imagine that when the nobility is still back in Gondor, hanging out in Osgiliath and Minas Tirith, when they learn that okay, one viable claimant has survived and he just won the battle, there is probably a solid exhale of okay, phew.
So glad it came down to the easy pick. Yeah.
Right. This will not cause chaos. We can just pick this guy.
Right. That makes sense. Fascinating stuff. All right, Matt.
So finally, we're going to start talking about Cirion and Eorl, the title of this section of the book. Now that we're all the way into this, however long we've been talking already, we learn about the desperate straits that Cirion finds himself in more than 500 years later. So this is 2509. People who the text says are no doubt akin to the Wainwriters are preparing an assault, and Cirion remembers the Eotheod, who unfortunately have moved out of the local neighborhood, which is the Central Vales of Anduin, and they're up north near the sources of the Great River now. He chooses 6 volunteer riders to take a message to Eorl, and only one of them survives the trip. That's Barondir. And he covers 950 miles in 15 days and runs out of food 13 days in, by the way. And that is 63 miles per day on horseback. Are there any comparable stories of incredible endurance that you're aware of? Is this possible, or is Tolkien maybe stretching it a bit here?
So this is possible, but it is on the outer edge of possibility, which is, appropriate for a heroic ride. Your general rules of thumb is that a swift movement for a large body of infantry is about 20 miles a day. 10 miles is more normal. Cavalry can move around 20 miles a day normally, and forced march around 40. And the Mongols can get up to 60 miles a day.
Okay. So the Mongols could do 60 a day, but it's only a little bit more than that here.
So if he is a Mongol, he's good to go. Now, he would, we can think about the logistics of this. While he's presented as moving alone, he's almost certainly not moving alone. He would need several horses. Mm-hmm. Realistically, he probably needs himself. He probably needs, because there isn't a set of way stations to change his horses on the way up.
Right.
You could actually, if you add that way station set, you could get faster than this.
Right.
But there isn't. And it's important to remember, whenever we hear about nobility moving in a medieval text or even in Tolkien, they're not actually alone. They've got guys with them. So you've probably got Borondir, maybe his 2 or 3 grooms, and their 15 horses.
Okay.
Is what this group looks like. And they would be changing horses as they're moving in order to maintain that kind of speed. And again, I go back to I talked about the Mongol with his horse string of 5 to 8 to 9 horses per rider.
There's no way he's doing this on one horse.
No.
Not a chance.
You'd kill the horse.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
A day in, that horse would be done. No. You're changing horses multiple times per day to keep up the speed.
Yeah.
in order to rest them. If you were riding to war, your war horse would be in addition to this because you would not want to ride him down before the day of battle. But this guy's a messenger, so he doesn't need a war horse. But yeah, it's possible, but it would be tricky. He would need a lot of horses.
Yeah.
Now, the good news is he's moving right up a river and through a relatively rich river valley, so his horses can graze as they go. To be clear, even at this speed, you're not like at a gallop the whole time, whatever the movies like to do.
He would have been in that one stretch where he was chased by the orcs for half a day.
I mean, yes, presumably.
Yeah.
But yeah. And the other thing I think we can say about his horses is that evidently, as with most agrarian armies, they are stallions, not mares, because he runs out of food.
Oh, yeah.
The canny Mongol would have brought mares.
Horse yogurt.
This is actually a difference because agrarian armies, generally speaking, fight on stallions because they're bigger.
Yeah.
And nomads fight on mares because they're logistically simpler. But yeah, like this is, again, heroically at the outer edge of the possible, but yeah, it's possible.
That is so typical of Tolkien, heroically at the edge of the possible. I mean, it's even Shadowfax, an essentially supernatural horse, and the journey that Gandalf made with Pippin from near Isengard all the way to Minas Tirith in such a brief amount of time. It was the same kind of thing. Like, even is that physically possible? And the answer is, well, maybe just barely, And he's very good at creating these just barely moments and making them heroic.
And I think part of that is it's worth remembering that, in addition to being immersed in medieval literature, right? This is also a guy that was a lieutenant in the Lancashire Fusiliers.
Yep.
And in that role, like he would have had to, here is how fast men can march. Like he would have had a field manual that had tables of this sort of thing. And so he would have had sort of some sense. And then, he takes kind of the normal and he basically doubles it. And this is what his heroes do. And that does tend to put him on the outer edge of the possible.
Yeah.
And it's never, I can't think of an example where it's just straight up insane, where it's something like an order of magnitude too fast.
Right.
No one does 600 miles in a day.
No.
That only happens in the Rings of Power TV show.
Boom. There it is, folks. 2 hours in, we knew it was coming. Oh, good stuff. Well, the amazing thing about Barandir, I have to say, is that less than 2 weeks later, he goes, yeah, I'll come down south with you to the field of Celebrant instead of like taking my retirement and hanging out at the northern end of the river. Because, man, I don't want to do that ride again. But it's the field of Celebrant that we want your help to sort of bring to life a little bit, because the text, as you said, does the sort of ... right? The description of the battle is fairly brief, so brief I can literally restate it here. And I would love your help to kind of enable us to imagine this a little more vividly. I actually find some of this movement in particular to be hard for me to picture clearly. The text says, when Eorl and his riders came to the field of Celebrant, the northern army of Gondor was in peril. Defeated in the Wold and cut off from the south, it had been driven across the Limelight and was then suddenly assailed by the orc host that pressed it towards the Anduin. So here I'm picturing the army is cut off from the south because the Wold is now to the south of where that army is. Now they're attacked by the orc host coming from the mountain, that is from the west. So they're being pushed in this little triangular wedge between the Limelight River and the Anduin. All hope was lost when, unlooked for, the riders came out of the north and broke upon the rear of the enemy. Then the fortunes of battle were reversed, and the enemy was driven with slaughter over Limelight. Eorl led his men in pursuit, and so great was the fear that went before the horsemen of the north that the invaders of the Wold were also thrown into panic, and the riders hunted them over the plains of Calenarthon. Now, the map is a little confusing here because if the enemies have cut off Gondor from the south and driven them north across the Limelight, how could riders from the north break upon the rear of the enemy? Help us see this battle a little more clearly if you can.
Yeah, I will admit when reading this, I had to pull up the interactive map of Middle Earth and zoom in and be like, wait, where are the rivers? Yeah, because you've got because of course you have the larger river, the Anduin, and then the narrow river that is the Limelight, which is a tributary of it coming in from the west.
Yeah.
And what I take this to mean is that Gondor's army has come up north through the Wold.
Right.
It has been attacked. My brain is spacing on the name of these people.
Oh, on the Balchoth. The Balchoth.
Yeah, there we go. The Balchoth. Yeah. They have presumably crossed the Anduin, and they have attacked Gondor's army, which is then retreated across, continuing to move north.
Right.
Across the river. And then You've got that army then remains south of the river, and then the orcs are pushing in from the west, from the Misty Mountains, pushing them in. And so our Erlingos are showing up in the rear of the orc army and then flowing them across, and one assumes the Limelight is a much easier to ford river, right? These armies treat the Anduin as a wall.
Right.
But the Limelight is crossable, but not easily. It's hard to get a sense of, with such a limited description, of what exactly Gondor's army, which is presumably, as it usually is, mostly heavy infantry, is doing here. I'll be honest, our ancient and medieval sources often describe infantry armies as being pushed or moved in this way. And even as modern historians, it's often very difficult for us to get a sense of what the actual mechanics of what that means and looks like is. I think one example, for instance, the Battle of Magnesia, this is a battle between the Romans and the Seleucids. The Roman left is, at the very beginning of the battle, basically caved in by the Seleucid cavalry charge that is their major offensive force. But what we're told is that the Romans are pushed back all the way to their camp, where that part of their army is reinforced and then rallied, and then fights a holding action while the Romans win the battle on the right. And the issue is always, to me, is like the distance between the point that impact must have taken place and the camp is like a few hundred yards. And I'm like, how do you get pushed back and still have enough cohesion at the other end to be functional? Because it's clearly not a rout. They're not like running willy-nilly over the field. There's something that can be gathered together and make a resistance. Nevertheless, it's clear that it happened. It's clear that this kind of push and pull happens. This may be, not physical shoving, but soldiers backing up or backing off from a fight they think they can't win, or what have you. So what seems to happen here, right, is initially Gondor, south of the Limelight, like they realize that they're overmatched, and especially against a cavalry opponent, moving across a fordable water course to put a natural barrier between you and them makes a lot of sense. You're now essentially daring them to attack across this natural obstacle into your, presumably by this point, formed up heavy infantry. And that plan works right up until you get flanked by a whole bunch of orcs. Right, who are on your side of the water, and as they press you back, create the opportunity for your opponents to also cross the Limelight.
Right, because now they're able to cross it unopposed. They're not having to come across into your lines.
Similar to what Alexander the Great is doing at the Battle of the Granicus, his first major engagement against the Persians. He makes this big effort, in this case with cavalry, to push across on the right, and then sort of folds the Persians off the river, moving towards the left to enable his infantry and the rest of his army to cross before assailing the main Persian force, which is actually mostly Greek mercenaries on the heights. It's not like a term of art or anything, but when I play strategy games, I tend to refer to this as jailbreaking the army, creating the opportunity to get them across the obstruction. You'll sometimes hear this described as levering somebody off of a position. So you now have a sort of combined enemy line that is probably in something like an arc, following the Limelight for some distance and then crossing it and then looping around into a kind of broad crescent. And it is that the Erlingos coming down, I'm trying carefully not to call them Rohirrim because they're not yet. Coming down the Anduin, and presumably coming down its west bank, they're going to show up behind the top of that crescent, right? Because it is facing down into that little triangle of land created by the joining of the Anduin and the Limelight. And just like Andahar is basically like, he is his battle is unrecoverable by the time he realizes he has a problem. If a large body of heavy cavalry is appearing unannounced behind your already committed field army, you're done. Go home.
It's those of you who can go home.
Right. Yeah. That's not going to work unless you are Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar does at Bibracte. He's being attacked mostly by infantry, not cavalry, but he does manage the incredible feat of taking the back third of his army, flipping it around, and attacking in two directions simultaneously, two opposite directions.
Wow!
But that's nonsense that Julius Caesar does.
Yeah.
And And I will note that if you read the text carefully, it seems like Julius Caesar has a huge help from his experienced junior officers, the centurions. They seem to be moving the units even before he can be giving the orders. So he's got a whole bunch of like sergeants who recognize the peril and turn around. These are things you can do with a Roman army that has a lot of combat experience and orc armies are not this well organized.
I was going to say, a professional Roman army, very different from the orc horde.
And the problem you run into, right, like we get this description of then the slaughter as the army rolls south. And here you can see, right, the problem. If you want to meet this oncoming heavy cavalry, you need to form either your infantry or cavalry into formation, and you need to meet them in good order. But the very thing disrupting your effort to do that is all of the orcs running away through your lines, fouling your formations, physically getting in the way of you trying to form up. And as you're not able to put your position together, and remember, the Gondorians are still right there pressuring your front. So if you simply turn to face, you will have flanked yourself. I can like easily see a situation where this just becomes a cascading failure. Where no one can quite get into position and the whole force falls apart. You know, once again, Tolkien loves these sort of surprise cavalry in your back situations a little more frequently than they happened historically. But yeah, when you can actually get your cavalry to materialize directly behind somebody else's army, that's all she wrote.
Yeah.
That's almost impossible. And in this case, they're behind a flank of the army rather than squarely behind the army. But once that flank collapses, the battle is clearly at this point unrecoverable and just begins falling apart. And then they push back across the Limelight, which is clearly not much of a river, and into the Wold.
Right. And that's what drives off the Valkoth. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Thank you. Because I had such a hard time picturing how the battle was flowing. And I knew that they saved the day. Like you said, that's what Tolkien does. He has a cavalry show up at the last minute.
Last minute. Yeah.
I'm thinking of, 40K and drop pods, if you could just beam your enemy right there.
To be fair, at the Battle of Helm's Deep, it's infantry that shows up to save the day.
Yes, even if the film showed as a cavalry.
I know. Grump, 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 grump,
I know.
grump, grump.
Where's Erkenbrand? Where was Erkenbrand when the
Erkenbrand, the second most hard done by character in the film adaptation.
After Glorfindel, of course.
After Glorfindel of Gondolin. Yes, correct.
All right, folks, we're going to be right back. And when we do, we're going to talk about the battles of the Fords of Isen finally. Folks, if you're enjoying the PPP, please consider supporting the show by joining the Fellowship of the Podcast. It's what gives me the time and resources to work on making the show better every season. When you join, you get the best Discord community around, and that includes live episode recordings, hangouts every month. You also can get episode postscripts, and boy, I'm telling you, there's going to be a lot from here. It's going to show up in there. You get ad-free episodes, free merch, and more.
You can also become part of our Questions After Nightfall episodes, or even join us as a guest in the North Wing. So please go to patreon.com/prancingponypod to show your support and join the Fellowship of the Podcast.
And of course, you can always help us out by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and a rating on Spotify. And please recommend us to your friends. Now, we have just finished our 3-episode-long look at the battles of the Fords of Isen. The first question for you, Bret, is related to Saruman. Now, one of the first things that we read of yours was your description of his strategic blunders when it came to Helm's Deep, in both the book and the film. He made a short-sighted blunder here, too. Saruman had ordered that Theodred be killed at all costs. That's never a good thing to say, at all costs, because as a result, at the first battle, all his fiercest warriors were engaged in reckless assaults upon Theodred and his guard, disregarding other events of the battle, which might otherwise have resulted in a much more damaging defeat for the Rohirrim. When Theodred was at last slain, Saruman's commander, no doubt under orders, seemed satisfied for the time being, and Saruman made the mistake, fatal as it proved, of not immediately throwing in more forces and proceeding at once to a massive invasion of Westfold. Finish the roast of Saruman here. How crushing a victory did he pass up by not moving in immediately? And was this connected to, or for similar reasons, his failure to be present at the battle, just like at Helm's Deep later on?
Yeah, so I believe my verdict on Saruman is that he's a dummy-wummy whose plans fail because they are bad. And that remains here. And yes, I think it's striking. And again, I think this is not a mistake of Tolkien, but I think a brilliant bit of characterization that Saruman is an engineer and a tinkerer and a persuader, but he has never commanded an army before.
No.
He doesn't have the experience of it. And he is delightfully outgeneraled by a series of very workmanlike Rohirrim commanders.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're going to get Elfhelm and Erkenbrand and then eventually Theoden, who are perhaps not as clever as he is or don't understand the universe as much as he does, but have actual experience commanding armies.
Yeah.
And one of the real problems here is, Saruman sends out his forces under the command of lieutenants, and he does not command them or accompany them personally. And I think one can't help but feel that, in his own kind of raging inferiority complex, he is aping Sauron, who does this. And the difference is that Sauron has the Witch King to command his armies. Sauron has a highly capable battlefield commander who has been long tested over many, many wars, and Saruman does not. And so, you get a campaign that is marked all over the place by missed opportunities and mistakes. More broadly, I think it's really striking that Saruman is making, in the decision to prioritize Theodred's death, he is making a whole lot of strategic choices, which are not necessarily good strategic choices. And here, I've written about this, but Saruman's plan is a clockwork mechanism which will fail if any one of the components fail.
Yeah.
He has a force out to recover the ring. If he succeeds everywhere else and fails at that, then he gets bum-rushed by the Witch King and is destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And then he also has a force looking to overthrow Rohan. If he gets the ring but loses to Rohan, he still loses. So he needs every element of this very complex plan to work. And they're all gambles, and we know they're all gambles because they all fail. Like, every part of the clock comes crumbling down. And the decision to kill Theodred is one of these, because yes, Grima can do his Grima thing for a while, but in practice, killing Theodred functionally guarantees war with Rohan.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He has locked himself in to war with Rohan and with Gondor, whereas prior to this, he had some optionality. I think, if Saruman doesn't get the ring and his 10,000 orcs show up to defend Minas Tirith, who's going to look a gift horse in the mouth? Right? He sacrifices his optionality in this moment under the belief, which the text note was correct, that Eomer and Theodred are the leaders in the kingdom that could mobilize it against him, and he needs to remove them.
Yeah.
But he chooses to remove them in such a blunt and obvious way that he locks himself in to a set of strategic options that in the end he does not actually have a favorable outcome. So this is one of those really complex plans. But then, having committed to it, having rolled the dice, he continues to hedge his bets.
Yeah.
If you've committed to war with Rohan in this moment, then go for it.
Then commit. Right. Exactly.
This reminds me of one of Partial and Tully's critiques of the Imperial Japanese Navy's planning of its carrier operations in 1942. And they quit that what Japanese High Command did not realize is that there were only two kinds of battles in the Pacific, those which rated none of their carriers and those which rated all of them. This is a common sort of like difference splitting mistake, and Saruman is not understood, is that he has two kinds of battles, those that rate his full force without exception and those that do not.
Yeah.
And he shouldn't fight the second kind at all. And for the first kind, there's no point in not attending personally. You're hosed if you lose anyway.
Yeah. No half measures. Yeah.
Yeah. Instead, he hangs in his tower to gnaw at the end of old plots. And, he's going to lose control over both his operations, or all three, I guess. The effort to get the ring, because his guys, insufficiently informed, grabbed the wrong hobbits. Because they don't know what they're looking for, and so they don't know to check to, like, do you have a small unadorned gold ring?
Right.
Because he can't trust them, but it's like, if you can't trust them, then go yourself.
Exactly.
Right? And he tells his commanders, like, you need to make sure Theodred's dead. And so they're like, well, we killed Theodred, and we've taken a lot of casualties doing it, so I'm going to back off.
Mm-hmm.
When, in fact, yes, this is the moment to commit.
Yeah.
There's no reason. And you should roll the ford and then detach a small force to pick off or at least isolate Helm's Deep and then blitz Edoras. You've committed. Your enemy is unprepared. You're ready. Go. And he's not there to make that call. And so instead we have this long delay during which the fort is both reinforced and fortified.
Yeah.
When we next see it, there are earthwork forts on either side of it, which are going to make his, the eventual forcing of it much more costly. And so, I mean, I think it is really striking that Saruman is brilliant and intelligent and persuasive, but he is not good with armies and he is not good with political decision-making, which is a tremendous irony because the thesis of Saruman's entire war is that the House of Earl with, a thatched barn where brigands hang out,
right,
and their children roll on the floor, right? These people are unworthy of lordship. Yeah. Why should Theoden be in charge of a large state and not me? And then he proceeds to demonstrate why.
He sure does. He demonstrates it quite clearly. Oh, I think we've got one last question here. In the second battle of the Fords of Isen, there is, and we've hinted at this already, a difference of opinion between Elfhelm and Grimbold. Elfhelm thinks that now that the Fords are not only less important, but an actual trap. He's sort of the Admiral Akbar of the Rohirrim. Suggesting that Saruman's ability to send troops down either side is definitely a problem. Grimbold doesn't want to abandon the forts. He's a little bit old-fashioned here. He's arguing that defending the east side of the river is going to put troops at risk of being flanked by any additional units that come down the west and cross over. Now, it turns out, of course, all went ill, mostly because Saruman just had too many troops. I mean, quantity has a quality all of its own. But of the two of those, who was right and why?
Elfhelm was right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is, and Saruman's tactical plan in both cases is to try and trap the Rohirrim on the ford, using the fact that he has access to both banks. And he flubs his operational timetable, so his East Bank force shows up late. Mm-hmm. Although, Elfhelm is positioned to foil his plan regardless.
Yeah.
So I don't know that it would have worked anyway. You kind of get what Grimbold is saying.
Yeah. Because
this is a good defensive position. They built some earthwork forts around it. And he's like, I'm put in mind of George Meade's exclamation at the Battle of Chancellorsville of, I'm going to paraphrase, but by God, if we can't hold the top of the hill, we sure as hell can't hold the bottom of it.
Yeah.
They're right. The Grimbold is like, if I retreat off of this good defensive position, and remember, he's a Westfolder.
Yeah, that's true. That's his area. Yeah.
Where else am I going to defend? Now, the answer is Helm's Deep, the Hornburg. Mm-hmm. You're going to defend the Hornburg.
Because like you said, an army can't go past there and operate because they've got this massive force sitting there ready to threaten their rear or their logistics.
But that means surrendering the entirety of the Westfold to enemy foraging and pillaging.
Which, of course, Grimbold is not so keen on that.
Not so keen on that. He's like, I'd rather have this fight here. Mm. And he may be thinking, he's like, look, they attacked before, and yeah, we maybe got the Crown Prince killed, but we drove them off.
Right.
We've held this fort once. And so there's no better defensive terrain between me and my home. Mm-hmm. And this is a good spot to fight. Yeah, and I think we can do this. And what ends up blowing the plan is that Saruman's army is just way too big for these guys to really oppose in any open ground.
Yeah.
And of course, the other thing that for them is unknown, they don't know when Saruman is going to show up. Mm-hmm. And they don't know what's happening in Edoras, but they may also assume that Theoden and or Eomer is going to show up with more troops at some point.
Yeah.
And he may wish that we had held this very defensible and valuable position when he does, so we don't want to give it up too easily. Right? They don't know that Theoden is about to be moving, but Theoden is about to be moving. And Theoden's plan is to take his forces from Edoras and join up with them and with Erkenbrand to hold this fort. And to be clear, Theoden's plan isn't a bad one. I mean, it's inoperative because the fort is already lost by the time he's moving, but he has no way of knowing that. No. And his army, plus Erkenbrand's force in the Hornburg, plus Grimbold, plus Elfheim, probably is enough to offer a pitched battle on favorable terrain. Mm-hmm. They'll be outnumbered, but they have massive superiority in cavalry, and massive superiority in cavalry covereth a multitude of sins.
Especially when your enemy is led by General Saruman.
Yes. Polybius has a line where he says, if you have a choice between being equal to your enemy in all aspects or being inferior to him in every aspect but having a superiority of cavalry, you should choose the second. Now, it's a little amusing because the Romans are then going to beat everyone with a superiority of infantry, and Polybius documents this. But his point is fair. Having more cavalry really does help.
Yeah.
And so, like, Theoden's plan is a reasonable one. And you almost wonder if Grimbold isn't also thinking, right, he has no way to communicate with Eomer or Theoden.
Right.
But he can put himself in their shoes and ask, what would I be doing if I were them?
Yeah.
He doesn't know that Erkenbrand's appeal for help has gotten squelched by Grima. Probably assumes that the death of the king's son means the royal army is coming out.
Yeah.
And it is just somewhat delayed. And so I think, it's reasonable for him to assume in that, like, what would I do in the situation? And like, well, if I showed up with Theoden's army and found out that we had abandoned the ford without a fight and now had to fight in the open ground of the Westfold, I would be pretty upset with me. So we should make an effort to hold this spot so that when the big army comes in, we can have this battle on really favorable terrain. Now, in the event Saruman shows up too fast, he couldn't have known that was going to happen, but there it is. And Elfhelm is correct that he's like, yeah, that all could happen, but like under current circumstances, the west bank of this river is a giant trap. Now, in the event, Grimbold is able to fight his way out of the trap, and probably the chaos that all of that creates is a net win for Rohan. As I note in my series on Helm's Deep, I guess I am a military historian. If I were a military historian, analyzing this campaign, determining like the moment that I would say is decisive, like the moment at which Saruman loses is extremely early. And it is the moment after Elfhelm has been forced to withdraw off of this and Grimbold has broken out and escaped. And it is Saruman's forces dispersed to pursue and pillage instead of remaining concentrated. And I'm like, there you go. That's when you lost. Because Theoden's concentrated army can now move freely through your dispersed force and arrive at the Hornburg with the reinforcements that mean you can't take it. And so in a sense, like, I think Grimbold has reasons to make the decision he's making, but his decision is worse than Elfheim's. But it kind of turns out in the event to have a weird, chaotic, multi-part running battle that just disorders Saruman's army and prevents it from opposing Theoden's force as it closes.
Yeah.
And in the end, right, Grimbold's force is intact because, right, he's able to create a shield wall defense inside of his earthwork fort. And the tool that Saruman has that could solve that problem are the Uruk-hai. They're on the wrong side of the river.
Yep.
So what he's got are regular orcs who are, I think the text is something like they're just too small.
Yeah.
They're not physically big and strong enough to break through the shield wall. And then he's got the Dunlendings who are big and strong but lightly armored.
Yeah.
Which means these guys can charge and make a big impact. But, across the ancient and medieval history, light infantry that finds itself in extended contact with heavy infantry, horrifically one-sided carnage.
Yeah.
Because like you think about it and folks think about it as like, like the guy in mail armor has like, +4 AC or something. But like, yes, he is both less likely to be slain by the attacks of his enemies, but as a result, he can fight differently.
Right.
He can be more aggressive. He can be like, I can be aggressive against you because your sword swing won't do anything when it hits my mail. And I just need to nick you and you go down because you're wearing a t-shirt. It doesn't take a lot of force.
No.
Though as Tolkien notes in the text, right, this is because the Rohirrim have access to Gondorian metalworking, and that's where they're getting their mail.
Yeah.
And the Dunlendings just mostly don't.
No.
And that is a question of wealth. Mail was extremely expensive. As an armor, it was really good, super expensive. We have, for instance, some documents related to the militia of Bruges in Flanders in the 1300s. And the average and the well-to-do men of the city, for its defense, were required to equip themselves as heavy infantrymen with a coat of mail. And the average price for a coat of mail was almost a year's wages for a skilled artisan.
Wow.
If you were like a blacksmith or a candle maker in this town, like that was a major expense that you were required to undergo because of your status. But it's like, taking out a mortgage to buy a house, right? Like this is a major piece. And the Dunlendings are just too damn poor for anybody but their very most important people to be armored that way. Ironically, the inventors of mail, the Gauls, were in the same position. Mail is invented by the Gauls probably along the Danube River in what today is Hungary, and then it spreads out through the Gallic cultural sphere, which reaches through Austria, Switzerland, through France and northern Italy. But for them, mail armor was just the armor of chieftains and kings. Lesser men wore maybe textile armor, but only the very, very, very elite burials do we find mail. The Romans are a wealthier society. They adopt mail from these guys and they begin mass producing it for their heavy infantry. And so you get this situation where, ironically, the Gauls invent this defensive armor, but the Romans popularize it.
Yeah.
But the result is that when you have Gallic infantry fighting Roman infantry, if they do not carry them off at the first rush, if they don't just sweep the Romans out of position, if it becomes an attritional fight, it's extremely one-sided because the Romans are much better armored. And this is what's happening with Grimbold's shield wall. And when it becomes clear that they can't get anywhere, right, they draw back. He gets that pause. And then, right, he's been keeping half an array of cavalry in the middle, which is what you do. Yep. That's about 60 heavy horsemen. I think an array is 120. Mm-hmm. And so you can imagine, right? He just opens the shield wall on one side, and those guys, maybe in two lines of 30, stirrup to stirrup, come out. And his opponents aren't in formation to stop them. That punches a hole. He pulls his infantry through the hole, and they can't just mad chase because he has 60 heavy cavalrymen who aren't enough to drive off the enemy, but they are enough to buy the retreat of his army, skirmishing behind it as he moves off. And this means that his probably 1,000-ish, is my impression, infantrymen are available for Erkenbrand to relieve Helm's Deep later. Yep. So all of that to get around to the question, I think Elfhelm is correct and Grimbold is wrong. But in the end, it doesn't matter very much.
No. Well, that's certainly true. Yeah. And Grimbold's actions there, like you said, brilliant. The way, with getting the heavy cavalry out there to screen the retreat of the infantry.
Well, and he ends up taking Erkenbrand's place, commanding the Westfolder cavalry at the Pelennor Fields where he falls.
Yeah.
So he's rewarded for his excellent unit command. Whereas Erkenbrand is punted out of the movie in a crime against gods and men.
Seriously, man. Erkenbrand, Glorfindel, and Tom Bombadil.
I like Erkenbrand's character, too. Because, you can tell the reason he doesn't go with the cavalry is that he's older.
Yeah.
Right? He is an older man and he is experienced. And you can also see, I think, something of the character of the man, that he comes in to take control of this. And one, he doesn't assert control over Elfhelm because Elfhelm isn't in his org chart.
Right.
And he knows that would cause problems. But two, he's like, I'm going to let the two young men command the battle at the ford.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make sure that Helm's Deep is prepared for a siege. And then I'm going to start gathering up the levy and get ready. I think there are frontline battlefield commanders, and then there are organizational commanders that understand people. Dwight Eisenhower never fired his weapon in anger at any point in his career, but he did beat Hitler.
Yes, he did.
Because he could make George Patton and Bernard Montgomery get along, a feat that no other human has ever managed.
I'm trying to imagine.
Get along is a strong term.
I was going to say.
Not shoot each other.
There you go. That's not kill each other is actually a victory if you're involving those two. This was fun. Matt, shall we sign off?
Yeah, this was fantastic, Brett. Thanks so much for joining us. It's always an absolute pleasure.
Always a blast.
And
so much fun.
So enlightening. I learned so much, and I'm just sitting here if my, classes in school were this interesting, I would have paid so much more attention to history.
Seriously. It's like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much here. I'm going to have to go back and listen over and over.
From your mouth to my enrollment's ears.
The fact that the American educational system failed me so badly in that I had never heard of Pupienus from Roman history. That's how you hook the crowd in. Come on, we need to get a bit more theatrical with our education. That was marvelous.
Fun times. Brett, it really has been such a pleasure to have you on the Prancing Pony podcast again. Thank you for coming back. I know you're super busy. I know you're writing a book. We deeply appreciate your time, and we hope you'll come back again soon.
I hope so too. It was great to be here.
Well, folks, that wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony podcast. It also wraps up my time with my good friend, the Nerd of the Rings. It's hard to believe we've done 29 episodes together over the last 3 seasons.
Holy smokes. I did not realize it was that many. That's wild.
When you combine all 3 years.
Wow.
But of course, Matt's not completely gone. I can't get rid of him even if I tried. He's actually going to be back next week as one of my mini guests for a very special Tolkien Reading Day episode, the 10th Tolkien Reading Day episode we've done here on the PPP. I'll be welcoming Matt along with several of the fine folks that I've had the privilege of co-hosting the show with. They're each going to do a reading from Tolkien that fits this year's theme, fellowship and community. So please be sure to come back next week for that very special Tolkien Reading Day.
That's definitely going to be a fun one.
Oh, it is. Always is.
Now, Alan and I want to thank the members of Team PPP, as always, editor Jordan Reynolds, Barlaman Becca Davis, social media manager Casey Hilsey, and someone who enjoys having a really long title, event and Patreon community coordinator Katie McKenna, graphic artist Megan Collins, and website guru Phil Dean.
Please take a minute to check out the prancingponypodcast.com. That's where you'll find show notes, outtakes, Prancing Pony ponderings, as well as our online storefront where you can get PPP merch, including stuff with all the great episode artwork that Megan's been doing for the show over the last 2.5 years.
You'll also want to visit our library page. The Prancing Pony Podcast is, after all, a podcast about the books. So if you're interested in a book we've mentioned on the show, you'll find a link for it in our library. We do get a small amount of compensation when you make your purchase, and we thank you for that.
We also want to thank our patrons at the Kierdan's contribution tier. I'll start with DeMay in Alaska, Chad in Texas, Lance in New Jersey, Paul in Colorado, Joseph in Michigan, Kathy from North Carolina, Carlos in California, Brian in the UK, Jerry from Washington, Joe in Washington, Erwin from the Netherlands, Ben in Minnesota, Anthony in Texas, Zaksu in Illinois, Sarah in New Jersey, Joshua in Massachusetts, Lucy in Texas, Keith in Alabama, and Erica in Texas.
There's also Carson in Oklahoma, Vivian in California, James in Massachusetts, Ann in Kentucky, Sean in New Jersey, Mason in California, Maureen from Massachusetts, Olivia in London, Robert in Arizona, Nick in Wisconsin, Lewis in South Carolina, Thomas in Germany, Craig in California, Bailey in Texas, Kevin in Massachusetts, Julie in Washington, Bruce in California, Joe in Maryland, Nathan in Arizona, and Kevin in Pennsylvania. Thank you all so very much for your support.
I'd like to add Grimbold in the Westfold, but I'm not so sure now that we've told him that he was wrong. But thank you, folks. Appreciate your support.
Make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe now through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, your questions for the next time Bret joins us to Barlaman at theprancingponypodcast.com.
And if you want your voice literally heard, just send us audio of your question. Visit podinbox.com/prancingponypod and record your question for us. Please be sure to still email the question to Barlaman, though.
Now, even though Barlaman's been a lot more reliable lately, there is still a lot of mail to sort through. We'll get to you just as soon as we're able. As always, though, this has been far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
This is the end. We are going. We are leaving now. Goodbye.